Chapter 20. Rita Skeeter's Scoop. Now that Christmas had come and gone, and the flurry of excitement surrounding the Yule Ball was spent, a sort of tired calm had fallen over all of Hogwarts. The Slytherin common room was much quieter than it had been lately, many yawns punctuating the lazy conversations. It was time now to think of the homework they had neglected during the first week of the holidays. Everybody seemed to be feeling rather flat now that Christmas was over everybody except Cass, who was starting to look slightly nervous. The trouble was that February the 24th looked a lot closer from this side of Christmas, and he still hadn't figured out anything to do with the clue inside of the golden egg. He brought it down into the common room so that Violet and Tracy could help him listen to its horrible, screechy wailing. But the only thing they managed to get out of it was a headache. They strained to come up with things the sound reminded of, but the only thing any of them could agree on was the 30 musical saws. "It's just nice," Cass had shouted angrily after their fifth attempt. "Just awful, bloody noise, that's all it is." He chucked the egg across the room shortly after, and that was the end of their work on the clue. If she'd hoped that now the ball had come and gone that things would go back to normal between her friends, Violet found that she was sorely mistaken. If anything, Cass and Tracy had only become more involved. It was a common sight to see them walking through the halls together, either hand in hand or with Cass's arms slung over Tracy's shoulders, while Violet trudged awkwardly beside them. She would have to write home and thank Aunt Petunia, Violet thought bitterly. For all the years she'd been forced to learn how to keep smiling while in one form of agony or another. That training was being put to good use now. It was a blessing when the first day of the new term started, putting some much-needed distance between the three of them. Violet set off to lessons alone, weighed down with books, parchment, and quills as usual, but also with the lurking cloud of confusing emotions hovering over her head, constantly threatening to pour down on her newly silken locks. Not quite ready to surrender her hair back to its usual knotted state, she had been applying another few drops of sleekies to it every morning since the ball. It felt wonderfully different to have it hanging loose about her shoulders rather than tightly braided, but she had yet to get used to it falling into her face every time she turned or moved. Her new hairstyle was one of several reasons Violet was very much looking forward to the next lesson of Beings and Beasts. She was hoping to speak to Lupin before Professor Snape, to get ahead of anything her head of house might say to her godfather about what she and George had gotten up to at the Yule Ball. But when she arrived early to his classroom, it was to find the door locked, with a neatly written note pinned at eye height. "Lessons are cancelled for the time being. I apologize for the short notice. Have a good day." Professor R.J. Lupin. Violet frowned at the note. What did that mean? Cancelled for the time being, with no indication of when they might start up again. It wasn't like Lupin to miss any classes that he didn't need to, and certainly not without a good explanation. Was he sick? He'd looked fine at the Yule Ball. Perhaps he'd simply had too much of the mulled wine and had yet to recover. On a whim, and with nothing better to do with her unexpected free period, Violet spun on her heel and began walking quickly back down the corridor, slipping through the throng of students hurrying toward their own lessons until she arrived outside the hospital wing. Just as she opened the door and poked her head inside, the bell signaling classes start rang overhead. There was no sign of Professor Lupin in any of the beds near the door, though several of them were occupied. A second-year boy was sitting with a bucket in his lap, looking very green and clammy, and across from him was a girl with heavy bandages covering both her legs from the knees down, whimpering slightly. Madame Pomfrey, who was tending to the bandaged girl, looked up as Violet stepped into the infirmary. "If you're unwell, Miss Potter, I will tend to you in a moment. If it's an emergency, please find yourself a cot and lie down," the matron said, looking back to her patient with a frown. "I'm fine," Violet said quickly. "I was wondering if, in that case, you ought to get yourself to class," Madame Pomfrey said shortly. "You've missed the bell, and I'm afraid I'm too busy to write a note for you. I won't have any gawking in my infirmary, so trot along." The bandages were now unwrapped enough to reveal the innermost layer, which was spotted heavily with what looked like blood. The girl whimpered again as Madame Pomfrey began peeling that away as well. Violet quickly averted her eyes. "I'm looking for Professor Lupin," she managed to say, though her voice did come out rather higher than usual. "Is he in here?" "No, he is not." Have you seen him lately?" Madame Pomfrey glanced back up at her with a frown. "No, Potter, I haven't." "If Professor Lupin is to be found anywhere, I should think it would be in his classroom." She lifted the bloody gauze, and Violet caught a glimpse something of raw and red where skin ought to have been. Her stomach lurched warningly. "Now, if there's nothing else, I must insist that you leave. I have to reapply Miss McDougal's ointments." Violet didn't need to be told twice. If Lupin wasn't in the hospital wing, then there was absolutely no reason for her to remain there, with Bucket Boy and the unbandaged girl. Leaving as quickly as was physically possible, Violet swept back up the stairs and tried not to think about what she'd seen. Moving through the halls was much easier now that they were empty. She made it to the third floor in record time and rapped smartly on the door to Lupin's office. After a long moment without answer, she knocked again. "Professor Lupin," Violet called. "Sir, are you in there?" Again, there was no response. She tried the knob and was dismayed to find it locked, just like the door to his classroom had been. Violet pressed her ear to the wood, listening for sounds of movement inside. Not that she thought her godfather would ignore her, but perhaps he was working intently and didn't hear, or maybe he was napping. But there was no sound at all coming through the door. If Lupin was in there, he was either unable to respond or unwilling. Neither of those were very good options in Violet's mind. She reached up and fingered at the leather cord around her neck, from which hung the little silver ring that had once belonged to her mother, with 3 milk-white stones set along the band. If she were to put it on, Violet could walk straight through the office door and see for herself whether Lupin was indisposed within. But was that the proper thing to do? What if she got in and he wasn't even in there worse? What if Hugh was, and got angry with her for breaking in? Would she get in trouble? Deciding to play it safe, Violet let her hand drop from the cord and knocked on the door one final time. "Remus," she ventured awkwardly. "It's me, Violet. I just wanted to see if you're all right." Again, there was only silence from the other side of the door. Violet's heart sank. Disappointed, she slung her pack more securely over her shoulder and turned, ready to walk away. She'd only taken a single step before the latch clicked. When she whipped back around, Professor Lupin's face was peering at her from the doorway. "Hello, Violet," he said softly, and though he was smiling, it wasn't his usual smile at all. The corners of his mouth were turned up, but there was very little warmth in it, and none of it reached his shadowed eyes. He didn't look ill, the way he always did on the times Violet had seen him after a transformation. He simply looked very tired. "Hello, sir," she said cautiously, turning around to face him fully. Is this a bad time?" "Not all," he replied. There was a funny sort of hoarseness to his throat, like he'd been shouting. Why don't you come inside?" Lupin disappeared from the doorway, and Violet followed after him. She was suddenly wary, and the state of the office did nothing to ease her mind. There was no mess, and nothing really out of the ordinary, with the exception of all the curtains being drawn. Every other time that she'd visited Professor Lupin in his office, it had been flooded with warmth, natural light, or as much of it as they could get this time of year. Now everything seemed colder and muted, including Lupin himself. He sat heavily in the chair behind his desk and gestured for Violet to sit as well. She did, and tried not to acknowledge the heaviness of the silence in the room. "I saw the notice on the door," Violet said, and even her quiet voice came out sounding too loud for the moment, "about class being cancelled." "Are you ill?" Lupin shook his head. No, I'm not ill," he said. He did not, however, offer any other explanation. Silence began to press in again. Did you have too much to drink last night?" asked Violet cautiously. Lupin let out a rather startled-sounding laugh. "Goodness no, Violet, I did not have too much to drink," he said, looking bemused. He rubbed the back of his neck as a wry smile flashed across his face and added in an undertone, though I'm beginning to wish I had. So how come we haven't got class today? Violet pressed. Professor Lupin sighed. Do you read Thedley Prophet in the mornings, Violet? No. Should I? Ordinarily, I would say yes, as I believe it's important for young people to stay up to date with the goings-on in the wizarding world. But today, I'm rather grateful for your ignorance. It gives me hope that most of your fellow students feel the same. That not many of them will have seen. He trailed off, frowning so deeply that his whole face seemed to sag into an expression of despair, aging him even further than the many fine lines around his mouth, eyes, and forehead already did. Violet sat forward in her seat. Won't have seen what? She asked. Is there something bad in today's paper? Is it about Sirius? No, it's got nothing to do with Sirius, said Lupin tiredly. Well, he is mentioned, but he sighed again, much more heavily, and rose slowly to his feet. Violet watched curiously as he crossed the room and stooped to pick something up off the floor. A copy of the Prophet lay in a disorganized heap, as though it had been thrown there with some force. Professor Lupin straightened the crumpled pages and opened it, folding it to one of the inner pages. It'll be quicker for you to read than for me to explain, he muttered hoarsely, holding the paper out for Violet to take. She accepted it and quickly looked at the open page. The first thing she saw was a photograph of Hagrid looking extremely shifty. The second was that the long article underneath was written by Rita Skeeter. Feeling increasingly nervous, Violet began to read. Dumbledore's menagerie, Albus Dumbledore, eccentric headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, has never been afraid to make controversial staff appointments, writes Rita Skeeter, special correspondent. In September of this year, he hired Alastair, Mad-Eye Moody, the notoriously jinx-happy ex-Sora, to teach defense against the dark arts, a decision that caused many raised eyebrows at the Ministry of Magic, given Moody's well-known habit of attacking anybody who makes a sudden movement in his presence. Mad-Eye Moody, however, looks responsible and kindly when set beside the part humans Dumbledore employs to teach our children. Rubeus Hagrid, who admits to being expelled from Hogwarts in his third year, has enjoyed the position of school gamekeeper ever since, a job secured for him by Dumbledore. Last year, however, Hagrid used his mysterious influence over the headmaster to secure the additional post of care of magical creatures teacher, over the heads of many better qualified candidates. An alarmingly large and ferocious-looking man, Hagrid has been using his newfound authority to terrify the students in his care with a succession of horrific creatures. While Dumbledore turns a blind eye, Hagrid has maimed several pupils during a series of lessons that many admit to being very frightening. I was attacked by a hippogriff, and my friend Vincent Crabbe got a bad bite off a flobberworm, says Draco Malfoy, a fourth-year student. We all hate Hagrid, but we're just too scared to say anything. Hagrid has no intention of ceasing his campaign of intimidation, however. In conversation with a Daily Prophet reporter last month, he admitted to breeding creatures he has dubbed blast-ended scroots, highly dangerous crosses between manticores and fire crabs. The creation of new breeds of magical creatures is, of course, an activity usually closely observed by the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Hagrid, however, considers himself to be above such petty restrictions. I was just having some fun, he said, before hastily changing the subject. As if this were not enough, Thedley Prophetha's now unearthed evidence that Hagrid is not, as he has always pretended, a pure-blood wizard. He is not, in fact, even pure human. His mother, we can exclusively reveal, is none other than the giantess Fridwolfer, whose whereabouts are currently unknown. Bloodthirsty and brutal, the giants brought themselves to the point of extinction by warring amongst themselves during the last century. The handful that remained joined the ranks of he, who must not be named, and were responsible for some of the worst mass Muggle killings on his reign of terror. While many of the giants who served he who must not be named were killed by auras working against the dark side, Fridwolfer was not among them. It is possible she escaped to one of the giant communities still existing in foreign mountain ranges. If his antics during care of magical creatures' lessons are any guide, however, Fridwolfer's son appears to have inherited her brutal nature. In a bizarre twist, Hagrid is reputed to have developed a close friendship with the children who brought around you-know-who's fall from power more shocking still. He is not the only half-breed to share this position. There is yet another wolf in sheep's clothing that lurks among the Hogwarts staff. Orwolf, to be precise. R.J. Lupin was appointed last year to the position of defense against the dark arts teacher without disclosing his disease to the parents of students being entrusted into his care. Perhaps recognizing the irony of the situation, Dumbledore has removed him from the post, but not from the school. Lupin has merely been shunted from one teaching role to another. An anonymous source revealed that the famously violent and bloodthirsty beast is only kept in check by an experimental and prohibitively expensive daily regime of potions, which render it capable of passing as an ordinary human. It seems an awful lot of trouble to go through to keep this mysterious Lupin at the school, which naturally begs the question: what manner of dark influence could the creature may hold over the school's aging headmaster? The answer is more harrowing than one might think, for while the werewolf may have little hold on a mighty wizard such as Albus Dumbledore, he certainly holds power over one of his most vulnerable charges, young Violet Potter, who, we have recently learned, is his goddaughter. It is yet another tragic twist in the ongoing tale of the Potter twins. With both parents famously murdered at the hands of you-know-who, Violet Potter is not the only one saddled with a dubiously unfit guardian. Harry Potter's own godfather is none other than Sirius Black, the recently acquitted mass murderer who broke himself out of Azkaban early last year. Taking into account their apparent connection with Rubeus Hagrid, the young Potters seem to be surrounded by an ever-growing number of dangerous monsters masquerading in wizards' robes. We can only assume, if not hope, that Albus Dumbledore has warned them and their classmates about the dangers of associating with part humans. Violet's hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking, but her hands, visibly crumpling the edges of the newspaper in front of her, were the only parts of herself that she could see, and the rest of her had gone alarmingly numb. She read the article twice. Then she read it again, just because she couldn't manage to tear her eyes away from the words printed on the page. "The creature," she said, when she was finally able to look up. She called youth creature. Professor Lupin had sat down again while Violet was reading. He was hunched forward, elbows on his desk, and hands clasped tightly together on its surface. His graying hair had fallen forward into his face, partially obscuring his eyes. "Yes, she did," he said after a moment. Violet was astonished to hear that he sounded faintly amused. "But how could she say that?" Violet burst out. She failed to see the humor in the situation at all. "How could anybody even think something like that? You're not a creature at all. You're not a beast, you're just a man." Professor Lupin let out a convulsive sort of gasp, as though he'd been struck with a heavy blow. His hands spasmed for a moment, then clenched tightly together once more. When he spoke, his voice was so hoarse it sounded painful. "Just a man." You have no idea how much it means to me to hear those words, Violet. Thank you, even if it is untrue. "It's not," Violet insisted firmly. "Ah, but it is, from a strictly legal standpoint." He glanced up at her, and Violet caught a gleam of sad hazel eyes beneath his untidy fringe. "We covered this on the very first of class, remember? Werewolves people like me are beasts. But that doesn't mean you're Acheratria or some kind of monster." She looked back to the article, glaring at the hateful words on the paper. "And you certainly haven't got any sort of dark influence over anybody, least of all me. And Professor Dumbledore asked you to come and teach at Hogwarts. It's not like you just showed up banging on the gates one day." A terrible fear suddenly seized her heart. Violet looked back up in a panic. "You're not going to leave, are you?" "I haven't started packing my bags just yet, no," Professor Lupin said quietly, "if only because Dumbledore has asked me not to. He's requested that I give him a little time to try and smooth things over before I do anything rash. Smooth things over with who? Violet asked. The paper only came out this morning. He can't have already gotten complaints. Lupin chuckled bitterly. I'm afraid he has. There's been a letter of inquiry from the Board of Governors, for one, and the headmasters of Durmstrang and Beauxbatons have expressed their disappointment in the fact they were not warned about my presence at the school before their arrival. Madame Maxime was particularly vocal about her unhappiness. Well, that's rich, coming from her, said Violet, outraged. Lupin gave her a questioning look. I mean, if Hagrid's part giant, then shed affinitelles too, so how can she complain about you? Professor Lupin shook his head. I wouldn't like to speculate on the headmistress's heritage, though I suspect you may be right. It's not anybody's business, but hers, and surely you can appreciate why she and Hagrid might wish to hide such a thing, if it is indeed true. I didn't even realize Hagrid was hiding it, Violet muttered. She frowned down at the photograph of Hagrid, of which he took up almost the entire frame. I mean, looking at him, I reckoned it was obvious. I just didn't think it mattered. You have a very kind heart, Violet, Lupin said, smiling softly at her. Would that everyone in the wizarding world were as open-minded as you and your brother. But as they are not, it remains very challenging and often dangerous for someone to openly live as a half-breed. Half-breed, Violet repeated, appalled. Their term, not mine, said Lupin lightly. It's not one I'm particularly fond of, but it's quite widely used. That's horrid. I'll hex anyone I hear calling you something like that. Lupin ducked his head, but not quick enough to hide the grin that spread across his face. That's very gallant of you, Violet, he said, quickly composing his features. Very gallant and touching, but unnecessary. I've been fighting my own battles for a very long time, and I've learned how to pick them accordingly. Violet looked away, hoping that Professor Lupin wouldn't see how terribly sad his words made her. He shouldn't have vetoed fight not just to be seen as a person, not just for the right toxist. She'd never asked how he became a werewolf, but from the state of him, Violet assumed it must have happened many years ago. Lupin bore clear signs of an impoverished life, and had once mentioned being unable to hold down a job for very long due to his condition. His employment at Hogwarts was a gift in more ways than one. Not only did it mean he could be close to her and Harry, as a professor Lupin was also given stable pay, a place to live, and the ability to go about his days with the respect and dignity that he deserved. The idea that anyone would want to take that from him over something he couldn't help, something that he did not choose was, frankly, monstrous in Violet's eyes. Who do you think told? She asked quietly, once more reading over the article in her hands. Skeeter says she learned about you from an anonymous source. She tapped the paragraph. Do you know who it was? I have no idea, Lupin said. His voice was soft, but he sounded deeply troubled. Violet bit the inside of her lip, thinking. Do you think it could have been Professor Snape? I don't, actually, said Lupin mildly. You don't? She asked, surprised. How come? Professor Lupin sat back in his seat, sighing. For starters, because Professor Dumbledore asked him not to. Severus has known about me being a werewolf since we were in school together, and I believe that if he intended to expose me, he would have done it long before now. Maybe he wouldn't do it openly, but if he could stay anonymous. For another thing, Lupin went on, gently, the article implies that I am being given multiple daily potions to try and manage my condition, and that this method may not be entirely proven. I can say with certainty that Professor Snape would not allow such slanderous inaccuracies about his work to go to print if he had anything to do with it. He has only brewed me a single potion which, as you know, is taken weekly and has worked perfectly every time. He paused for a moment. Every time that I have taken it correctly, I ought to say. Violet chewed on this information. She did in Twanto believe that Professor Snape would have been the one to publicly expose Lupin as a werewolf, but he was the most likely suspect in her mind. He disliked Lupin, had just last year assigned a very suspect essay on how to identify ankle wolves on the single day he covered for one of Lupin's classes. That S was the reason Hermione had worked out what Lupin was, and at the time Violet had thought that was bad enough. But no everybody knew. And if the Board of Governors was getting involved, or if the Ministry for some reason decided that Lupin was too dangerous to be living free, much less teaching children, he doesn't like you very much, Violet muttered before she could stop herself. Professor Lupin's lips twitched slightly, as though he were about to smile, but his eyes looked very sad. He sighed. No, no, I'm afraid he doesn't. But for all our differences, the fact remains that I am extremely grateful to him, not only for providing me with the wolfsbane potion, but for looking after you as well. What? I know that you and Professor Snape are quite close, at least close enough for him to be giving you advanced lessons, Lupin said. Is that still the case, or have things changed after last year? Violet looked down at her hands, suddenly awkward. She had never really thought of Professor Snape as someone who looked after her before. He's still giving me lessons, she said slowly. Not as many this year with the tournament going on. That must be frustrating for you. A bit, she said, shrugging. Shedidmiss being given the chance to learn something new and to try and prove herself capable of it. But I'm a bit relieved, too. It's been hard to focus lately, with how worried I've been about Cass and Harry. Have you ever confided in Professor Snape about your worries? Lupin asked mildly. Violet scoffed. No, of course not. The notion of going to Snape with any of her feelings was nearly as unthinkable as going to Uncle Vernon. We're not that close. It's not like we talk or anything. He just tells me what to do and how to do it, and sometimes he'll tell me if I've done a good job, but it's not anything like talking to you. I see, Lupin said, smiling slightly. I thought as much, to be honest. Severus has never been the friendliest fellow, and if there's one thing I can compliment him on, it's consistency. But the mention of Snape's friendliness stirred something in the back of her mind. Do you know that he's friends with Karkaroff? Violet blurted suddenly. Lupin's eyebrows shot up. I didn't know that, no. What gives you the impression that they're friends? Well, Karkaroff called him old friend, so I don't know if they still are. He keeps coming by to try and talk to Professor Snape, but Snape doesn't seem to want him around. Karkaroff has been coming into your classes, Lupin asked, now looking quite concerned. Not during lessons. No, but he hangs around Snape's office a lot, and they were walking around together during the Yule Ball when they caught me and Violet broke off suddenly, flushing. Thankfully, Lupin didn't press her. He looked to be thinking rather deeply about what she just told him. So you don't know how they know each other? She asked, and tried not to look too disappointed when Professor Lupin shook his head. No, I didn't realize they'd even met each other before the start of the tournament, he said, still frowning. That's very interesting. Thank you, Violet, for telling me. Something in the way he said the word, interesting, made the little hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Professor Snape's not, I mean. He wouldn't. She didn't know how to ask, how to voice the horrible little fear that had started to take root in the back of her mind since the first time she saw Snape and Karkaroff talking together. Sirius' voice echoed again through her thoughts. He's a Death Eater. You know what Death Eaters are, don't you? He's not dangerous, is he? The distress must have been plain on her face, because Lupin leaned suddenly forward and reached for her. Without even thinking about it, Violet placed her hand in his own. You have nothing to fear from Professor Snape, Lupin said, looking firmly into her eyes. That he is a teacher at this school, and has been for many years, speaks of the great trust that Dumbledore has placed in him, and believe me when I say that Albus Dumbledore does not grant his trust lightly. He trusted Lockhart, Violet muttered, trying not to stare at the faint, silvery scars upon scars that crisscrossed the back of Lupin's hand. Anquirel. Lupin squeezed her fingers tightly for a moment. Violet, listen to me, and look at me, please. Violet grudgingly lifted her eyes to lock with Professor Lupin's. If I thought for a single moment that Severus Snape, or anyone in this school for that matter, meant any harm to either you or Harry, I would not let them near you with my life. There is nothing I wouldn't do to keep you safe, and I hope you believe that. Do you? Violet nodded, blinking very hard against the tears that had begun to well in her eyes. Lupin squeezed her hand again, and this time she squeezed back. Would you like me to talk to Professor Snape for you? Lupin asked gently. If you're not comfortable with his lessons anymore, it's fine, Violet said quickly. It's not that. I like learning from him, but Karkaroff. I'll have a word with the headmaster about Professor Karkaroff hanging around where he shouldn't, said Lupin, his expression darkening slightly. He and Professor Moody are already keeping quite the close eye on him, as I understand it, but I suppose there's only so much they can do without risking causing offense. But loitering around classrooms is crossing a line. I'll try to put a stop to it if I can. Thank you, Violet mumbled. She was losing the battle against her own tears now, and no amount of blinking was going to hold them back any longer. Professor Lupin gave her fingers one last squeeze before pulling away. When next he held out his hand, there was a handkerchief in it. Violet hastily dabbed her eyes and cheeks and handed it back. Keep it, Lupin told her. I'm in the rare position of being able to afford spares these days. And I mean this kindly, but something tells me you may get more use out of it than I would. Violet sniffled and dabbed at her eyes again. Thanks for that, sir. The sound of the bell took them both by surprise. Lupin looked up at the ceiling with a sigh. I suppose you better be off, he said, looking back to her with a smile, a warm, genuine one, not at all like the pale imitation from when she'd first walked in. I'm sorry for earlier, when I didn't answer the door right away. You can always come to me, Violet, with anything that's troubling you. Violet was starting to feel overwhelmed. All the kindness and affection that Lupin offered was so foreign to her. All her life she'd had no one to rely on but Harry, no one who cared for her but her brother. The idea that other people might care about her, as well, was still taking some getting used to. As she stood in the doorway, bag slung over her shoulder and ready to depart, Violet quickly turned around and flung her arms around Professor Lupin's middle and told him, I'm really glad you're here. Lupin's arms went around her shoulders at once. She felt his chest swell with a deep, shaky inhale. So am I, he muttered hoarsely. By lunchtime, the newspaper article and its contents had spread throughout enough of the school that it was only a matter of time before the entire student body was let in on Hagrid's and Lupin's secrets. People gathered in the halls in whispering clusters, speaking behind their hands and looking fearfully over their shoulders, as though they expected to see some sort of monster charging up the corridor toward them in broad daylight. What was most surprising to Violet was how few people seemed to be talking about Lupin and how many people seemed to be talking about the grid. Professor Lupin was known to every single person in the school. He taught last year's defense against the dark arts classes and taught them well, which had apparently earned him a lot more goodwill than Violet at first realized. Course he knows all about dark creatures, if he's supposed to be one. Learned more from him last year than we ever did from Lockhart. If Lupin's a werewolf, then I'm a bloody centaur. What sort of werewolf goes around handing out toffees from their pockets? Lupin's outward appearance as a mild-mannered, soft-spoken man with a fondness for sweets and a good joke seemed to be working in his favor. No one had ever been frightened of poor, sweet Professor Lupin. Hagrid, on the other hand, whose booming voice, wild black beard and mane, and unnatural height had driven more than one first-year to faint, was not so fortunate. I was scared of Hagrid at first, too, but all you've got to do is say 2 words to him to realize how lovely he is, said Tracy loudly, after overheard a group of trembling second-years. The 12-year-olds scattered in the face of her ire, squeaking as Tracy glared after them. To try and calm her down, Violet relayed the details of her quest to find Professor Lupin, including the ghastly sight of the bandaged girl in the hospital wing. Tracy grimaced. Morag MacDougall, she said grimly. Padma told me the whole Ravenclaw Tower got woken up by her screaming. Apparently, she was trying to get rid of the hair on her legs, permanently, only she took all the skin with it as well. Violet shuddered violently, thinking of the brief but horrible glimpse of redness she had seen beneath the bandage. All that for a little hare. Snow was still thick upon the grounds, though no longer pristine. It had been muddied by numerous snowball fights, as well as by students tramping back and forth between their classes. Nobody was looking forward to care of magical creatures in this weather, though as Tracy said, the Scroots would probably warm them up nicely, either by chasing them or blasting off so forcefully that Hagrid's cabin would catch fire. When they arrived at Hagrid's cabin, however, they found an elderly witch with close-cropped grey hair and a very prominent chin standing before his front door. The Gryffindors were already waiting, shivering where they stood, and Violet quickly found her way to Harry's side. "Who's she?" she whispered, glancing up at the stranger. "Professor Grubblyplank," Harry whispered back, frowning. "She says Hagrid's indisposed." "What does that mean? He's not, he hasn't left, has he?" But Harry only shrugged, looking mistrustfully up at their temporary professor. "This way, please," said Professor Grubblyplank, and she strode off around the paddock where the Beauxbatons' horses were shivering. Violet and Harry followed her, looking back over their shoulders at Hagrid's cabin. All the curtains were closed. Was Hagrid in there hiding, or had he packed up and left like Professor Lupin wanted to do? "What's wrong with Hagrid?" Harry asked loudly, hurrying to catch up with Professor Grubblyplank. "Never you mind," she said, as though she thought he was being nosy. "I do mind, though," said Harry hotly. "What's up with him?" Professor Grubblyplank acted as though she couldn't hear him. She led them past the paddock where the huge Beauxbatons' horses were standing, huddled against the cold, and toward a tree on the edge of the forest, where a large and beautiful unicorn was tethered. Many of the girls, including Tracy, oohed at the sight of the unicorn. "Oh, it's so beautiful," whispered Lavender Brown, a Gryffindor girl. "How did she get it? They're supposed to be really hard to catch." The unicorn was so brightly white it made the snow all around look grey. It was pawing the ground nervously with its golden hooves and throwing back its horned head. "Boys, keep back," barked Professor Grubblyplank, throwing out an arm and catching Harry hard in the chest. "They prefer the woman's touch, unicorns. Girls to the front, and approach with care. Come on, easy does it." She led the girls slowly forward toward the unicorn, leaving the boys standing near the paddock fence. Violet couldn't help but stare at the beautiful creature before them. It had wide, liquid-looking blue eyes, which gazed around at them all with a keen intelligence behind them. Its mane and tail shone like pure silver, and though the single spiraling horn sprouting from its forehead wasn't very long, they could see that it ended in a wickedly sharp point. "Here now, girls, one at a time," said Professor Grubblyplank, passing single sugar cubes around to each of them. "Don't crowd and be gentle. Form a line now, please, and see if she'll let you give her a pat or two." The girls lined up quickly, all quaking with excitement for their turn at touching the unicorn. When Violet stepped to the front of the line, she found herself suddenly nervous. She had seen a unicorn only once before, though there hadn't been any beauty in the sight of it lying dead on the floor of the forbidden forest. Legs sprawled at odd angles, leaves and branches tangled in its shimmering mane. Now that she was seeing a live one, it accepted her offered sugar cube, nibbling it gently out of her open palm with its soft, slightly pink mouth. Violet could understand the full horror of the previous death. To slay something so gentle, so pure and intelligent. It was a monstrous crime indeed, one that Lord Voldemort had committed more than once in his quest for eternal life and to return to his former power. Violet's hands were trembling as she stepped away from the unicorn in a way that had little to do with the cold. She remembered, suddenly, that her own wand held a core made from a strand of unicorn hair. Perhaps that was why the creature affected her so strongly. The sudden sound of raised voices reached her ears, and Violet turned in time to see Harry snatch something out of Malfoy's outstretched hand, the rest of the Gryffindor boys huddling close around them. While Professor Grubblyplank was distracted, Pansy Parkinson had just approached the unicorn, which was now pawing anxiously at the ground. She hurried over to see what all the fuss was about. "What's going on?" she demanded, pushing her way to Harry's side. His face was twisted into a scowl, and in his hand was what looked to be a clipping from Thedley Prophet. She recognized it at once as Rita Skeeter's article, which Malfoy had apparently cut out and been carrying around with him all day. This was evidently Harry's first time seeing it. "Don't," Violet said, trying to grab the clipping of her brother's hand. Harry twisted out of her grasp and began to read aloud, the frown on his face becoming more pronounced with every word he said. "What do you mean? We all hate Hagrid," Harry spat at Malfoy, who was sneering openly at them both. Violet used his distraction to finally snatch the article away from him, hearing it was somehow much words than reading it. "And what's this rubbish about them?" He pointed at Crabbe, getting a bad bite off a flobberworm. "They haven't even got teeth." Crabbe was sniggering, apparently very pleased with himself. "Well, I think this should put an end to that oaf's teaching career," said Malfoy, his eyes glinting. "Half-giants and werewolves, and Merlin knows whatever else Dumbledore's got on the staff. Do you reckon McGonagall's got a bit of hag blood in her? Is that just wishful hay? That's still mine, Potter." Malfoy's exclamation was not directed at Harry. He was staring at Violet now, eyes wide. She smelled smoke. When she looked down, she saw that Thedley Prophet article had burst into flames in her hands. For a moment, nobody moved. All of them stood there staring at the scrap of paper in Violet's hands, watching it blacken and curl as the flames slowly consumed it. It was Harry who broke the silence and burst into action. "Violet!" he hissed, knocking the burning paper from her hands and stomping it out in the snow. The tips of Violet's fingers were tingling, and faint bits of smoke were still wafting from them. She looked up to meet Malfoy's wide, startled eyes. "Oops," she said. Malfoy's face twisted. Are you paying attention over there?" called Professor Grubbly-Plank, making them all jump. She caught sight of Violet and beckoned stiffly. "Over her, girl with the others." "Quickly, please." Violet didn't look back at Malfoy and the others as she staggered back to the other girls, hands balled into fists and thrust deep into her pockets for good measure. She stared unseeing at the unicorn, whose many magical properties Professor Grubbly-Plank was now enumerating in a loud voice, so that the boys could hear too. At the end of the lesson, Violet did her best to hurry across the lawn before anyone could accost her, but Harry was far too quick for that. "What'd you do that for?" he whispered angrily, joining their arms together like they used to do when they were very young, as a way to try and block out anyone who might be looking at or listening to them. Violet shot him a glare. "I didn't mean to, Harry. You know I can't help it sometimes. But I thought you were getting better at it. You told Hagrid you wouldn't any more, and now right in front of Malfoy and everyone." "I just told you I couldn't help it," Violet snapped. "And how can you blame me after reading that? Monsters masquerading in wizards' robes." "Harry, it's awful," Harry grimaced. She knew he agreed with her, but could still see the argument written all over her brother's face. Violet gave his arm a squeeze. "Look, I'm sorry. I'll try harder to keep my temper. Really, I will. I promise." This at last satisfied Harry's anger, as she knew it would. Promises were not made lightly between the two of them. And after seeing the looks on not only Malfoy's face, but the other gathered Gryffindor boys as well, Violet knew that her lack of control was becoming more and more dangerous. "Just be careful, Violet," said Harry quietly, releasing her arm at last. "I worry about you, you know." "Yowery," Violet exclaimed. "I think I'm the one who has a right to worry. Harry, how's that egg coming along for you?" Harry's face reddened immediately. Fine, almost done with it, actually," he lied. "I'm supposed to meet with Ron and Hermione about it. Now I mean, so we can solve it all the way. And then he sprinted away from her across the snowy lawn, dodging her hurled snowballs and abuse all the while. Chapter 21. Friendship and Other Fragile Things. There was a Hogsmeade visit halfway through January, which was just the breath of fresh air that Violet needed. The last 2 weeks had been sickening. A representative of the Board of Governors had come by to evaluate Professor Lupin. While he had been miraculously allowed to keep teaching, Violet delightedly learned that for every letter Dumbledore had gotten from parents angry about a werewolf teaching their children, He'd Gatentwo more from parents, who said their children claimed Lupin was the best teacher they'd ever had. It was only with the caveat that students wishing to take his class required signed parental permission, much like those wishing to visit Hogsmeade. Both Susanna Runcorn and Theodore Nott had dropped beasts and beings because of it. Violet, however, had gotten Lupin himself to sign her permission form, much to his amusement. While Professor Lupin had done an admirable job of keeping a stiff upper lip in the wake of Rita Skeeter's article, there was still no sign of Hagrid at all. He didn't appear at mealtimes. He wasn't seen going about his gamekeeping duties on the grounds, and Professor Grubbly-Plank continued to take the care of magical creatures classes. Malfoy was gloating at every opportunity. Harry liked to complain about the grief that Malfoy put him through, but he only had to deal with it in the halls and a handful of shared classes. Violet, who had to endure Malfoy's company on a near-hourly basis, had little pity for her brother. Missing the Elephant Man, Malfoy kept calling to her from across the Slytherin common room, lounging by the fire with his gang of cronies. Missing your half-breed pal. He'd only used that one once. True to her word, Violet had soundly hexed him for it. Malfoy had scampered off, spouting threats about telling his father and Professor Snape, neither of whom frightened Violet in the least. Lucius Malfoy had been removed from the Board of Governors 2 years ago and had no power over her, and Professor Snape, who while still very present and powerful, had apparently forgotten she existed. After their mortifying encounter at the Yule Ball, Violet had been unable to so much as glance at her head of house without feeling like she was going to be sick. She kept flashing back to that look in his eyes, to the feeling that it brought welling up inside of her. At first she'd feared Snape would bring it up during class, taunt her, call her a disgrace to Slytherin House. What she hadn't expected was nothing. No humiliation, but also none of the praise or encouragement that Violet had grown used to receiving from him during potions lessons. He walked right past her cauldron without so much as glancing at it, and paid no special attention to the way she'd finally chopped or crushed or skinned her ingredients, nor had he called her back after class to arrange a time for any extra lessons. And despite being assigned a legitimate detention at the ball, Violet had yet to receive any sort of summons on the matter. She didn't know what to make of it. Potions class had always been her haven now. Every time she set foot into the dungeon classroom, Violet felt like she was walking on eggshells. Worst of all, Professor Snape wasn't the only one who'd stopped paying attention to her. Spending time with Cass and Tracy had begun to feel less like she was part of a friend group and more that she was an intruder, a squeaky wheel mucking up an otherwise functional vehicle. Never mind that Cass barely looked at her any more, not directly, and never in the eye. He would speak to her, carry on whole conversations with the two of them pretending that nothing was wrong, but Violet didn't fail to notice the way his blue eyes slid right over her, or the snarling, gnashing beast that awoke in her chest whenever she looked at him. It was anger, she told herself, over and over. Anger and jealousy. When Saturday morning finally came, Violet rose early and dressed quickly. She was already halfway through breakfast when the lovebirds that had replaced her best friends made their way into the great hall, hand in hand. "Good morning," Tracy said brightly. She sat next to Cass now, opposite Violet, rather than beside her as she had always done before. "Did you save any toast for us?" Violet, whose mouth was currently packed with buttered toast, smiled thinly and shrugged. "I'm so excited to get out of the castle today," Tracy continued moments later, once she put together a small plate for herself. "It feels like it's been ages since the last Hogsmeade trip, and it looks like it snowed again last night, so it's all beautiful out there. I can't wait to get out in it." "Where do you want to go?" Violet asked, suddenly excited as well. Maybe if they were out of the castle, just the three of them running around together, things would go back to feeling normal again. The swelling bubble of hope in her chest was immediately popped when Tracy said, "Cass and I were thinking of going to this little shop I heard some of the other girls talking about. What was it called again, Cass?" Cass, who already had a cup of tea halfway to his lips, muttered, Madam Pudding something, I think." Madam Puddifoot's, Tracy exclaimed. That's right, thank you. Apparently it's this adorable little cafe with all sorts of teas and little cakes and stuff. Doesn't that sound cute? Violet, trying not to let the sudden sickness she felt show on her face, just smiled and said, Yeah, sounds great. You'll have to tell me about it. Oh, don't you want to come as well? Tracy asked, eyes widening. Sorry, I didn't mean to make it sound like you weren't invited. I'm sure we can get a table for 3 if you want. It's fine, Violet said quickly. The thought of following Cass and Tracy on their date, having to ask for a special chair to be brought over for her to perch awkwardly in, was almost too much for her stomach to bear. You two go ahead. I'm a meeting someone anyways. For the first time in a week, Cassius looked at her. Who? George Weasley, Violet said at once. We're meeting up for butterbeers later. This was a lie. Violet had no idea if Fred and George were even going to the village today. She was oddly pleased, however, to see that her words made Cass scowl. Tracy, on the other hand, giggled loudly. Ooh, you two have been getting pretty close, haven't you? She teased. She twined her arm with Cassius, once again knocking the wind from Violet's sails. Before the ball, I didn't realize you even fancied him. Roman 6 suppose you got to know each other over the summer, didn't you? I suppose we did, Violet said evenly. She glanced quickly around the great hall, hoping against hope that George might be walking through the door at that very moment, giving her a tidy escape from the table. Unfortunately, he wasn't, but another opportunity did present itself in the form of her brother and his friends, rising together from the Gryffindor table and looking as though they meant to head out. Violet pushed her empty plate away and hopped to her feet. I've got to go, she explained hastily. I, told Harry I'd leave with him. Another lie, but one that neither Cass nor Tracy thought to question. She left them behind without a backward glance, jogging up alongside Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Mind if I walk with you? Violet asked, casually linking arms with Harry. Go ahead, Harry said. He glanced over his shoulder at the Slytherin table. Do you want to wait for they'll catch up, she said, cutting him off. Harry and Ron exchanged glances, but said nothing else as the 4 of them set off through the cold, wet grounds toward the gates. As they passed the Durmstrang ship moored in the lake, they saw Victor Crumb emerge onto the deck, dressed in nothing but swimming trunks. He was very skinny indeed, but apparently a lot tougher than he looked, because he climbed up onto the side of the ship, stretched out his arms, and dived right into the lake. He's mad, said Harry, staring at Crumb's dark head as it bobbed out into the middle of the lake. It must be freezing, it's January. It's a lot colder where he comes from, said Hermione. I suppose it feels quite warm to him. Yeah, but there's still the giant squid, said Ron. He didn't sound anxious, if anything, he sounded hopeful. Hermione noticed his tone of voice and frowned. He's really nice, you know, she said. Not at all like you'd think, coming from Durmstrang. He likes it much better here, he told me. Ron scowled, but said nothing. Violet recalled their fight at the Yule Ball and Harry's brief mention of Ron trying and failing to take Hermione to the dance. Some pieces were fitting into place about all of that now. Harry seemed to be looking around for someone all the way down the slushy high street, disappointed in not finding them. He suggested a visit to the 3 Broomsticks, and Violet eagerly backed him up. Though it wasn't snowing, there was a cold breeze that kept whipping down the lane, biting bitterly through their cloaks and robes. If nothing else, the 3 Broomsticks was guaranteed to be warm. The pub was crowded as ever, and this time there wasn't even a single table to fit the 4 of them. They ordered a butterbeer each and took their seats at the long bar. Doesn't Heaver go into the office? Hermione whispered suddenly. Look, she pointed to the mirror behind the bar, and Violet saw Ludo Bagman reflected there, sitting in a shadow corner with a bunch of goblins. Bagman was talking very fast in a low voice to the goblins, all of whom had their arms crossed and were looking rather menacing. It was indeed odd, Violet thought, that Bagman was here at the 3 Broomsticks on a weekend when there was no Triwizard event, and therefore no judging to be done. She watched Bagman in the mirror. He was looking quite strained, like he was under some enormous amount of pressure. But just then Bagman glanced over at the bar, saw Harry, and stood up. In a moment, Violet heard him soar brusquely to the goblins, and Bagman hurried through the pub toward them, his boyish grin back in place. "Harry," he said, ignoring the rest of them. "How are you? Been hoping to run into you. Everything going all right?" "Fine, thanks," said Harry. "Wonder if I could have a quick private word, Harry," said Bagman eagerly. "You couldn't give us a moment, you three, could you?" Okay," said Ron, even as Violet opened her mouth to protest. She was shuffled off between Ron and Hermione toward a table that had just opened up, throwing anxious looks back at her brother. Bagman had led him along the bar, to the end furthest from Madame Rosmutter. "What's he meeting with goblins for?" Violet muttered, keeping her eyes on Bagman's bright, animated face. "And what does he want with Harry?" "Dunno," Ron shrugged unhelpfully. "Harry said he spoke to him before the first task, too, but I forget what it was about." "Well, that's not very helpful," Violet said, a bit snippily. She was spared the consequences of her rudeness by the door of the pub opening once more and Fred and George stepping inside. "Bloody hell, it's freezing," Fred said, stamping the snow off his boots on the threshold. He was the one to look up first, to spot Ron and Hermione and Violet at their table. When George looked up as well, his eyes landing right on her, Violet felt the breath catch in her throat. His freckled face split into a smile, and the two of them headed over together. "Hi," said George, grinning at her. "Hi," she said back, and was mortified by how breathless she sounded. She looked away quickly, clearing her throat. Do you want to sit down?" "Here, let's all budge up." "Where's the boy, wonder?" Fred inquired, pushing his way into the seat between Hermione and Ron. "Not off slaying another dragon, is he?" "He'd better not be, not without giving us tickets," said George. He took the seat on Violet's left, flanking Ron as well. His nose was pink from the cold, and Violet had to clench her fist under the table to stop the ridiculous urge to brush the snow out of his hair. "He's talking to Bagman," said Ron, thrusting his chin in the direction of the bar. Fred and George whipped around at once. My," said George quietly. "The man himself. Should we go and buy him a drink?" "I think we should," said Fred. "Excuse us, ladies," he said, winking at Ron, who scowled, and then he and George were on their feet again, making a beeline for the bar. "What's gotten into them?" Ron grumbled, craning his neck to watch as Bagman brushed off the twins, gave a last boyish smile to Harry, and then hurried his way out of the pub. The goblins all slid off their chairs and exited after them. A moment later, Harry and the Weasley twins rejoined them at the table. "What did he want?" Ron said, the moment Harry had sat down. "He offered to help me with the golden egg," said Harry. "He shouldn't be doing that," said Hermione, looking very shocked. "He's one of the judges." "And anyway, you've already worked out, haven't you?" "Uh, nearly," said Harry, and Violet knew at once that he was lying. The others, oblivious, seemed to take him at his word. "Well, I don't think Dumbledore would like it if he knew Bagman was trying to persuade you to cheat," said Hermione, still looking deeply disapproving. "Not unless he's trying to help Cass as well," Violet added. "He's not, I asked," said Harry. "Aren't you giving Warrington enough help?" Ron asked hotly, staring at Violet. She glared back at him and sipped her butterbeer. "Those goblins didn't look very friendly," said Hermione quickly, trying to break the tension. "What were they doing here?" "Looking for Crouch, according to Bagman," said Harry. "He's still ill, hasn't been into work." "Maybe Percy's poisoning him," said Ron. "Probably thinks if Crouch snuffs it he'll be made head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation." Fred snorted loudly. "What perfect Percy? Not likely," sides. "Even if he was, I doubt the paperwork would check out." "See here, lad, it's Sace with Irby, not Weasley," he said, donning a rather nasally, posh impersonation. Hermione gave the two of them a don't joke about things like that look and said, "Funny, goblins looking for Mr. Crouch. They'd normally deal with the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." "Crouch can speak loads of different languages through," said Harry. "Maybe they need an interpreter." "Oh, enough about Barty Crouch," said George with a grimace. If I have to listen to Percy list all the bloody languages he speaks one more time. He started in on an unkind, though highly accurate, impression of Percy. Mr. Crouch can speak Elvish, and Giant, and Garbledeggook, and Troll, and on and until somebody finally shuts him up. You know, I reckon Crouch doesn't even speak half those languages who would know the difference. It's all just a bunch of noises. I bet anyone could daft that. Violet choked on her butterbeer. A light bulb had just gone off over her head. She rounded on George. Say that again, she demanded, staring into his startled face. Anyone could do that. No, before you said, it's just a bunch of noises, he repeated questioningly. Violet could have kissed him. In fact, she did, seizing him about the ears and hauling his face over to hers with a wet smack. There was a sudden, bright flash of light, and the two of them jumped apart as though burned. The smell of smoke was unmistakable in the air, but there was no fire. Rita Skeeter was standing in the doorway. She was wearing banana-yellow robes today. Her long nails were painted shocking pink, and she was accompanied by her paunchy photographer, whose camera was still raised in their direction, smoking faintly. Well, said Rita Skeeter, stepping slowly toward the table where the six of them sat. She was smiling, and all three of her gold teeth were visible. What have we here? A bit off-romance. Why, Violet, I would never have guessed you had it in you. Harry was on his feet at once. Stay away from my sister, he said loudly. A few people looked around. Rita Skeeter's eyes widened behind her jeweled spectacles as they snapped to him. Harry, she said, beaming. How lovely, and here was I thinking my readers would have to settle for some bit piece about Ludo Bagman. Why don't I come and join? I wouldn't let you near us with a 10-foot broomstick, said Harry furiously. You've done enough, thanks. We don't need you ruining our lives further. And what did you do that to Hagrid for, eh? Rita Skeeter raised her heavily penciled eyebrows. Our readers have a right to the truth, Harry. I'm merely doing my who cares if he's half giant, Harry shouted. There's nothing wrong with him. The whole pub had gone very quiet. Madame Rasmutter was staring over from behind the bar, apparently oblivious to the fact that the flagon she was filling with mead was overflowing. Rita Skeeter's smile flickered very slightly, but she hitched it back almost at once. She snapped open her crocodile-skin handbag, pulled out her quick quotes quill, and said, How about giving me an interview about the Hagridiano, Harry? The man behind the muscles. Your unlikely friendship and the reasons behind it. Would you call him a father substitute? Her eyes flicked to Violet. And you as well, Violet dear. You're quite close with your dog for excuse me, godfather. Would you say he's been a great influence on you? A model for behavior, perhaps. Violet stood so abruptly that her chair clattered to the ground behind her. You horrible woman, she said through gritted teeth. You don't know anything about him. And you don't care, do you? Anything for a story, and anyone will do, won't they? Even Ludo Bagman. Sit down, you silly little girl, and don't talk about things you don't understand, said Rita Skeeter coldly, her eyes hardening. I know things about Ludo Bagman that would make your hair curl. Not that it needs it, she added, eyeing Violet's tangled curls. She hadn't bothered with the sleekiesies today. Violet felt a hand on her shoulder and looked around. Hermione was standing now too. Let's go, she said. Come on, Roman 6 Harry. They left. Many people were staring at them as they went. Violet was shaking, trembling so hard she could barely walk, if not for George's arm wrapped firmly about her shoulders. Fred shouldered hard into the cameraman on the way out. She'll be after you again, Violet, said Ron in a low and worried voice as they walked quickly back up the street. I don't care, said Violet, shaking with rage. She's vile, and she's a liar, and I'm sick of her spewing rubbish about people she doesn't even know. Harry and Hagrid and now Remus. She won't get away with it. You don't want to go upsetting Rita Skeeter, said Ron nervously. I'm serious, Violet. She'll dig up something on you, not if I have anything to do with it, said Hermione, a fierce scowl on her face. Nothing gives her the right to talk to you like that. We'll show her what silly little girls are capable of. She can't scare us into hiding. Hermione set a brisk pace toward the castle, striding so fast that Ron and Harry were struggling to keep up with her. Violet tried to march on, but the fury she'd felt was leaking out of her with every step she took, replaced by a deep, lurching sickness as the reality of the encounter with Rita Skeeter sunk in. Violet's legs wobbled beneath her, and she would have fallen if not for the arm that quickly looped around her shoulders. "You all right?" said George, looking very worried as he steered them toward a snow-covered bench. Fred looked indecisively between the two of them and the direction Harry, Ron, and Hermione were heading, before George waved him off toward the latter. George and Violet were alone, sheltered under the narrow awning of the post office. Violet, predictably, began to cry. Oh no, don't," said George, sounding slightly panicked. He started rubbing circles into Violet's back, which only made her cry harder. That's what Harry would do always since they were children. "Violet, it's okay." "It's not," Violet said wetly. "It's not okay at all." "She has our picture of us kissing," offered George, eyebrows raised as he smiled. "What's so bad about that?" Violet made an ugly, phlegmy noise of shame and disbelief. "What so? You saw what she wrote about me last time and Tracy." "If she prints that picture and some horrible story beside it, then they'll think. They'll think I'm the luckiest bloke in Britain. That's what they'll think," said George firmly. "And that you're an idiot for settling. Or maybe they'll think I'm after your millions. You have got millions, haven't you? Otherwise, I just don't think things are going to work out between us." A bewildered laugh bubbled up from the tightness in Violet's chest. It had been a constant of the Weasley twins, their ability to make her laugh even when she didn't feel like it. It was a quality she'd always loved about them, and loved George for it all the more. He was looking at her with a terrible sort of fondness, terrible only because she had never seen anything like it before, and again Violet found herself blushing. She was aware, suddenly, of what a mess she must look. "Sorry," she said. She wiped the tears from her face with practiced precision. "I still believe her. What was she even doing here in the first place? And why did she have to walk in right then?" "Bad luck, I reckon," George shrugged. "Or good luck, depending. Do you regret it?" "What, kissing you?" said Violet coyly. She giggled, still sounding a tad watery. "No, I don't think I do. I'd regret not hexing her face out the back of her head, though," George laughed. They were sitting so close together that Violet could feel it through her chest, the same as she could when Crookshanks sat purring in her lap. "Maybe next time," he said with a grin. "I'll provide a distraction. I am, after all, a genius, as you said." Violet giggled again. She felt rather like she'd been possessed by Pansy Parkinson all of a sudden, simpering and blushing and making a fool of herself. But George didn't look as though he minded in the least. He looked almost unbearably smug, in fact. Violet was tempted to kiss him again, just to wipe the expression right off his face. But this time she was aware of just how many people were out on the street around them, and how many more might see if she did such a thing. George's words did jog something in her memory, however. She turned to him and said, "You are a genius. It was your brilliant impersonation of Percy that helped me figure it out after all." "Figure what out?" said George, tilting his head to the side. An expression of mock horror overtook his features. "Oh no, don't tell me it's Percy you were thinking of when you snogged me." Violet let out a snort of laughter. "No, of course not. You're definitely the only Weasley I'd prefer to snog. Oof, that's a relief. There's so many others, you see, and I don't think I could take it if you and Ron—" "Will you let me finish?" Violet said, fighting to keep the grin off her face. The tears were so thoroughly forgotten that she almost wondered if she'd really cried them after all. "I really think I might have worked it out now, thanks to what you said." "Work it what out?" Violet looked around conspiratorially, decided it was safe, and leaned in to whisper the clue. George's face went blank for a moment, and then lit up. "You mean the Triwizard clue," he said eagerly. "Go on then, what is it?" "I don't know yet, but now at least I think I know how to work it out," Violet said. "Because what you said was something I hadn't even thought of, and I doubt anyone else has either." "You know that horrible, screechy noise the egg makes when you open it?" George nodded, hanging excitedly onto her words. Violet leaned in even closer. She could smell the butter beer on his breath, nutmeggy and sweet. She could see the reflection of her own green eyes in his brown ones, and when she whispered it was in a voice so soft that she was certain no one in the world could have heard it besides the two of them. It's not justness, it's a different language. George's eyes widened. Bloody hell. That's brilliant, Violet. What language do you reckon it is? I don't know, Violet said, shaking her head, but that's still more of a lead than we had before. Maybe if I can find out what different languages sound like. You said troll is just a load of grunting, so it's probably not that. What about the goblin language? Do you know what that's like? Bit raspy from what I've heard, not a lot of shrieking. Right, so not that either. How many languages can there be? Well, Percy says Crouch speaks over 100, so George shrugged casually. Just a few, I suppose. Violet groaned in dismay. So much for getting a lead. Hey, chin up, said George, nudging her gently with his shoulder. Like you said, it's more than you had before. I reckon if you hit the books and pester Pince enough, you'll have worked out that clue in no time. I hope so, Violet muttered. George hadn't moved away after bumping her, and she was enjoying the warmth of his arm against her own. If Harry's as far behind as I think he is, and I think he's really behind, then he'll need as much help as me and Hermione can give him. What about Warrington? George asked, good-naturedly. You Slytherins are meant to be all cunning and clever. Hasn't he worked it out by now? But Cassius was the last person that Violet wanted to talk about right now. She shook her head, nose scrunched slightly, and said, Not that I know of, no. Not that you know of, George repeated, giving her a sidelong sort of look. I thought you'd be the first, oh no, seeing as you're best mates. Tracy's my best mate, Violet said automatically. I mean, Cass is a friend, a good friend, but he's not, she shrugged awkwardly, not entirely sure what she was trying to say. Cass was a good friend, and that was how she'd always thought of him, a friend. But after their confrontation about the Yule Ball and the way things were between them now, it didn't feel right to call him a best friend anymore. She didn't know what they were anymore. He asked me not to take you to the ball, you know, George said, out of the blue. Violet's mouth fell open. What? George shifted awkwardly. Sorry, maybe I shouldn't have said. I mean, since you're still mates and all. No, I want to hear it, Violet said. He really asked you that? Well, ask is a bit of a stretch. I suppose more like heddled me not to. He came up to me after class and asked for a word, then just came right out with it. What did he say? Violet pressed. It felt like someone had come along while she wasn't looking and tied her guts into knots. He was pretty blunt about it, George said with a small grimace. Tell Violet Potter you're not taking her to the ball, were his exact words, if I recall correctly. I asked him why I would do that, and he said, because you're not going to. I told him that. Well, yes, I just asked her, and he tells me to go tell you that I changed my mind and didn't want to take you after all. That's when I started laughing. He didn't like that, by the way, and told him to, shove it. The faintest ringing had taken up between Violet's ears, like a cloud of mosquitoes circling her head. And then what? She heard herself ask, though her own voice sounded muffled and far away. Did he say anything else, or? Didn't say much, no, George said, shrugging slightly. Thought he might try and hit me for a moment, but I reckon he thought better of that pretty quickly. George, along with Fred, had been a beater on the Gryffindor Quidditch team for as long as Violet had known him. She'd seen him play, and had also had the pleasure of seeing him in short sleeves before. Cass might have been fit in his own right, but if it had come to blows between him and George, there was little doubt as to who would have come out on top. But the mere idea that it might have come to that it ever had gotten anywhere near an actual fist fight. And for what? For her. It was absurd. Should I have listened to him? George asked quietly, and Violet looked up to find him watching her, a small crease between his brows. If I've gotten in the way of something, or messed things up with the two of you, no, Violet said at once. It's not like that, really. Cass is just a friend, I swear, and he's with Tracy now anyways. He did ask me to the ball, but it's not like I was expecting him to. I might have gone with him, I suppose, if you hadn't asked me first, but you did, and I'm glad. I'm glad I went with you." She could feel her face getting hot again, cheeks flushing even in the cold. And George was still looking at her, though the little lines of worry were gone now, replaced by another one of those slow, easy smiles that made Violet's insides feel so fluttery. The knots in her belly were starting to unwind themselves. "I'm glad I went with you too," said George, and there was no hiding the pinkness creeping across his freckled face. You're a really cool person to spend time with, Violet. I think I could get used to having you around." "Yeah," Violet gave him a wobbly smile. "Maybe I'll get used to being around then." George grinned, leaning toward her. "Promise." Violet, fighting a giggle, nodded and leaned in as well, and then they were kissing. It was a little awkward. Their noses kept bumping together, and they were still in the middle of the main thoroughfare, and a little silly and very wonderful. Never mind the cold or the occasional people passing around them. None of it really mattered at the moment. Harry and Cass and their golden eggs could wait a little bit longer, she told herself, sighing as George slipped an arm around her waist and pulled her close. Just a bit longer. It was nearly dark by the time Violet made it back to the castle, her pockets stuffed with goodies from Zonkos and Honeydukes, and her mouth curved into a small, serene sort of smile that she couldn't seem to shake. She and George had caught up with Fred and Lee Jordan, after it became truly too cold to remain on their secluded little bench any longer. The other boys made no comment when she and George strolled up, hand in hand, and didn't seem to mind her tagging along as they went from shop to shop, laughing and plotting their next adventure in mischief. She learned that Weasley's wizard wheezes were still well underway, and their lines of trick wands, such as the one they'd given Ludo Bagman at the World Cup, now came in 2 editions. The first, which she had already seen, simply turned into a rubber chicken upon use, while the newest version was fully capable of animating itself and beating its unfortunate victim around the head. The twins assured her they had several more products in the works, but wouldn't spill the beans no matter how many times she asked. Violet did notice, however, that they purchased a rather large amount of fizzing Whizbees during their trip to Honeydukes. After making it back to the slithering common room on her own, Violet had very little time before dinner to drop off her purchases in her trunk and to change out of her heavy cloak and boots, both of which were now sodden with melted snow and mud. She considered, briefly, setting them to dry in front of the fireplace in the common room rather than leaving them for the house elves to attend to, but the fear that neither would be there upon her return outweighed her sense of moral righteousness. She did, however, bundle a handful of sweets onto her folded cloak, along with a quickly scrawled note reading, "Candies for the elves. Thank you." She took the stairs out of the dungeon 2 at a time, and arrived at the Slytherin table, out of breath, but just in time for all manner of delicious food to fill the platters and bowls in front of them. Tracy was already seated and stared as Violet heaved herself, huffing and puffing, into the seat across from her. "Did you run here from Hogsmeade?" she asked incredulously. Violet, who was drinking deeply from her goblet of pumpkin juice, shook her head. "Dungeons." She gasped, surfacing for air. "Hungry. Didn't want to be late," Tracy laughed. "You didn't want to miss getting a slice of cake, you mean?" Violet, whose love of cake was well established, flushed and grinned. That too. With her breath coming back to her, she noticed the empty space beside Tracy. "Where's Cass?" "He should be along," Tracy said, glancing obviously toward the double doors Violet had just come through. "We ran into Professor Moody on the way back from the village, and he wanted a word." "With Cass?" Violet asked, surprised. "What about?" Tracy shrugged. "Dunno. It didn't seem like he was in trouble. Moody just asked to talk to him. I didn't think it would take this long, though." It was very odd that Moody would want to talk to Cassius in private. Violet was under the impression that Moody didn't like him very much. Was Cass in some sort of trouble? Could Moody have come up with a reason to punish him, just as Professor Snape often did to Harry? "Good," said a nasty, bitter little voice in the back of Violet's mind. "I hope he's scrubbing bedpans after how much of a prat he's been." "So," said Tracy, bringing her attention back to reality. How was your day in Hogsmeade? Did you get to spend any time with George? Oh, yeah, a bit. She decided that she didn't want to tell Tracy about the run-in with Rita Skeeter and the embarrassing photo that had been taken. We had a drink at the Three Broomsticks and did a bit of shopping. How was Madame Puddifoot's? This was apparently what Tracy had been waiting to talk about, judging by the way her eyes lit up. It was wonderful, Violet, she sighed dreamily, elbows on the table and chin in her hands. There's all these little tables sat around, and you can order all sorts of tea and snacks and just sit and talk for as long as you like. It's not crowded like the Three Broomsticks. There were only about 4 or 5 other people besides us in there, so we didn't have to shout to be heard or make room for anyone. And the place itself was so cute. You should have seen all the doilies. Violet smiled and nodded encouragingly as Tracy went into great detail about the tea shop's decor, which all sounded a little too frilly for Violet's taste. One thing that stood out, amid the description of lacy hangings, was just how good of a time Tracy and Cass had had together. The thought of them sitting together, holding hands in a cozy, intimate cafe, gazing into each other's eyes. It was easier to drown out Tracy's words when dessert appeared on the table. With her face stuffed with gooey chocolate cake, she was less expected to make any response other than grunts. Dinner came to an end, and still there was no sign of Cassius. Violet searched for his face over the heads of the crowd pouring out of the great hall, but he was nowhere to be seen, nor was Professor Moody. Back in the Slytherin common room, after most people had disappeared into their dorms, Violet leaned in toward Tracy and said, I think I've got a lead on the Triwizard clue. Tracy, who had been staring anxiously at the entrance to the boys' dorms, perked up at once. She listened with increasing excitement as Violet told her about George's words and the revelation they'd sparked. Maybe the clue wasn't just Nosit all, but another language. Oh, but that makes so much sense, Tracy whispered excitedly. Of course they wouldn't give the champions a screaming egg for no reason. It must be a test of wits or something. What language do you think it's in? I don't know, and I don't even know where to start looking, Violet admitted. They don't even teach other languages at Hogwarts, do they? No, but I can think of at least one place to start. Where? Where will we start? Said Tracy, getting to her feet. With books. It was true that good, old-fashioned book research had never failed them before. Though it was too late to go to the library, Tracy pointed out yet another brilliant starting point, Violet's small but impressive collection of what she called monster books, about, and some were even written by mysterious creatures and non-humans. Surely one of those books would hold some answers, or at least another hint to send them chasing after next. They decided to study out in the common room rather than tucked away in the privacy of their dormitory. They could watch for Cassius and fill him in on anything they'd learned in the meantime. The common room gradually emptied as the evening wore on, though not as empty as Violet would have liked. Malfoy was in his usual place, by the fire, Crabbe and Goyle hanging around him like the oversized bodyguards they were, and Pansy perched pointedly at his side on the arm of the sofa. Every once in a while, their laughter and voices would rise and carry over to the table where Violet and Tracy sat, and Violet was almost sure they were doing it on purpose to distract her. I wish they'd just shut up and go to bed already, she grumbled, after Pansy's piercing laughter had split the air once again. Malfoy can't have said anything that funny. Oh, but I think it's sweet, Tracy said, but her tone was mocking. They found the only other person more annoying than themselves. I think they deserve each other. Both girls giggled, peering sneakily toward the fire. Pansy's arm was now draped over Malfoy's shoulders, and for once he seemed to be enjoying the attention. Suddenly, Tracy squealed. Romans 6, give me your book. Did you find something? Violet asked excitedly. No, but it looks heavier than mine. Heavier? Why does it matter how heavy? But her eyes followed to where Tracy's finger now pointed to the table and the big black bug that was scuttling hurriedly across it. Hurry, it's getting away, Tracy cried, leaping to her feet with book in hand. Don't, said Violet, blocking the heavy tome before it could come down on the bug. Don't squash it. It's not hurting anybody, look. It's only a beetle. The beetle scrambled aimlessly as Violet cupped her hands around it, gently guiding it into her palm and away from Tracy and her improvised mallet. Ah, don't let it bite you, Tracy said, eyeing the big distastefully as Violet got to her feet. Or sting you, or whatever it is they do. It's not going to do either, are you, little bug, said Violet patiently. How did you get in here? You're very far from home. She stepped up to one of the many shelves that lined the walls of the common room. This one was full of lost and found, with many misplaced scarves, gloves, and assorted trinkets piled sloppily on its shelves. With a bit of coaxing, she got the beetle to climb out of her hand and into somebody's missing shoe. There, now you're somebody else's problem. Tracy was not impressed. I feel like you should go and wash your hands, Romans 6. It's only a beetle, Violet said again. There's loads of them in my aunt's garden every year. I've caught bunches of them before. Funny how it ended up all the way down here, though. I still say you should have squashed it, said Tracy, glaring over at the shelf where the beetle now resided. Tell you what, I'm keeping this big book of yours, just in case it comes back. But switching books didn't make any difference in terms of the research they were meant to be doing. Violet's collection was largely limited to the description of monsters, their habitats, and what sort of ingredients could be harvested from them for potion making or alchemical purposes. There was next to nothing about what languages any of them spoke, other than a brief but vivid mention of an irrumpant mating call. The only relief they got was Malfoy and company heading off to bed and taking their noise with them. Finally, after another fruitless hour had passed, Tracy let out a great yawn. That's it, she sighed, stretching her arms out over her head. I can't keep my eyes open any more, Romans 6. I suppose it's pretty late, Violet said. She checked the clock and was startled to find that was 1:45. She'd been so focused, the time had just slipped by without her noticing. Oh no, Tracy, I didn't even realize. You should get to sleep before you pass out at the table. You're not coming, she shook her head. I want to finish reading through this. Romans 6, it'll be here tomorrow. I know, but it's only a couple more chapters, look. She held up the book, pages pinched between her fingers for proof. Tracy sighed again. All right, it's your funeral. She stood and stretched once more before turning toward the dorms. Night, Violet. G-night, Tracy, Violet said, smiling faintly at her. She listened to the sound of Tracy's sleepy footsteps on the stairs and the Lochlancarf, the dormitory door being shut before turning back to her book. It was much quieter now that she was alone, without the sound of Tracy's soft breathing or the scrape of her turning the pages of her own books. The minutes that had flown by before now seemed to drag on for ages. A mere 4 pages later, and Violet was regretting her decision to stay awake. She just resigned herself to defeat when the sound of a door opening came from behind her, and Violet turned around to see Cass stepping into the common room. He saw her too, and froze. Hi, Violet said, after an awkward amount of silence had passed. Just getting in. Yeah, Cass answered, sounding equally as awkward. Were you, waiting up for me? Violet shook her head and held up her book again. His expression fell slightly. Right, yeah, that makes sense. He shifted his feet, glancing past her toward the stairs. Suppose I should get to bed, then? Cass shifted oddly as he turned toward the boys' dormitory. It looked to Violet like he was hiding something behind his back and doing a bad job of it. What are you holding? She asked bluntly. Cass's face went slightly pink. Oh, this. He moved his arm from behind his back, as if he'd just been holding it there for comfort, and showed her what he'd been hiding, the golden egg. Violet, now deeply interested, shut her book and set it aside. What we're doing with that? She asked, turning in her seat to face him properly. Cass shrugged. Just working on the clue, he said evasively. He nodded to the pile of books on the table in front of her. Looks like you've been busy. I'm working on the clue, too. Oh, find anything? She hesitated. I might have. What about you? What's your hair all wet for? She could see it now that she was really looking. Cass's robes were dry, but his hair looked as though he'd been caught in a downpour. He immediately ran a hand through his hair and scowled when it came away damp. I took a bath, he said, sounding defensive. Not a crime, is it? Violet nodded pointedly to the parcel under his arm. With the egg. Cass closed his mouth, then opened it again. Yes, with the egg. The hot water. Helps me think. He glanced around the empty common room, then added, You should tell Harry to give it a try. Violet's eyebrows shot up. I should tell my brother to go and shower with his egg. Not sure, it has to be, but Cass shut his mouth again. They stared awkwardly at one another. This was the most they'd spoken since Christmas, just the two of them. Of course it was going to go poorly. Look, said Cass finally, when the silence had gone on too long for comfort, I'm a bit tired, all right. I'm gonna go, dry off and go to bed, so if you'll excuse me. He tucked the egg more securely under his arm and started toward the door of the boys' dormitory. Did you tell George Weasley not to go to the ball with me? At first, Violet didn't realize that the question had come out of her mouth. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, hadn't even meant to think it, but the words had come blurting out before she could stop them. Cass froze. Did he tell you that? He said, after a long, tense moment. Yes. He turned back toward her, shoulders rigid. His mouth, too, was set into a hard, straight line. And you believed him? She swallowed hard. I don't know what to believe. That's why I'm asking you. So. Did you? Cass stared down at the floor between them, and Violet could see his jaw clenching and unclenching over and over as the seconds ticked by. Yeah, he said, eventually quietly. Yeah, I did. But why? Violet asked. Why would you? She broke off when Cass laughed. Why? He repeated. There was an edge to his voice. Why do you think, Violet? Because he wanted to take you instead. But you knew George had already asked me, Violet pressed. I told you he did, and that I'd said yes, so what did you have to go and bother him about it for? I thought it was a fluke, Cass snapped, all traces of laughter gone from his face. A joke. I thought you were settling, because he was the first half-decent bloke to ask you before I got round to it. I didn't think you actually liked him. Why would I say yes to him if I didn't like him? Violet asked, incredulous. What, did you actually believe I was just waiting for you to ask me the whole time? By the stricken look that flashed across Cass's face, yes, that was exactly what he'd thought. Violet stared at him, mouth agape, as she digested the full scope of the situation. How could Cass believe that she was only with George to make him jealous? What had she done? What signs had she unknowingly given to make him think such a thing of her? What about Tracy? Violet asked, staring at him. Cass looked at the floor again. What about her? He muttered. The words were a dagger to Violet's heart. Why, if you felt so strongly about me, did you ask her to the ball? Why did you ask her the same way that you tried to ask me? Did you even mean it? Romans 6, you know I do, not for me, for her. Did you mean any of the things you said? She said angrily. Or were you just repeating it because you didn't have time to come up with anything better? Cass's brow furrowed. It was a wonder he hadn't burned a hole through the floor, so intense was his stare. Violet wanted to slap him. She wanted to march across the room and grab his robes and shake him, to yell until everyone woke up and came out to see and hear what an utter bastard was being about this whole thing. Everyone but Tracy. Tracy, who had been so excited about being asked to the dance. Tracy, who had nothing to deserve this, who was just happy to have a boyfriend. Tracy, who'd be devastated about playing second fiddle to Violet again. I do like her, Cassius muttered, just as the last strand of Violet's temper began to fray. Tracy, I mean, I like her, really I do. She's funnier than I realized before, and she thinks about things in ways that I wouldn't have, or wouldn't have paid attention to in the first place. That's something I've really liked about being with her. Violet stared at him, frozen, listening. Finally, Cass lifted his eyes to meet hers. But she's not you, Violet. That was too much. Tears welled up in Violet's eyes, not tears of joy or tenderness, but tears of heartbreak. Heartbreak on Tracy's behalf. I can't help it, Cass said, almost pleading as he looked at her. I'm not trying to be cruel or make things complicated, Romans 6. It's just always been you. Always. Violet's lower lip trembled. That's not fair. I know it's not, but what can I do about it? I don't know what I can say to you. Can't say anything, Violet told him, her voice suddenly harsh. I don't want to hear anything else from you. Just go to bed, okay? Cass took a step toward her, looking on the verge of tears himself. Violet, please. I said go to bed, she said, too loudly. Cass stopped in his tracks. Violet couldn't stand to look at him anymore, with his lying mouth and his sad, heartless eyes. What right did he have to cry after all he'd done? They stood there, roles reversed, with Cass's eyes on her face and her eyes on the floor, still and silent for what felt like ages. Finally, time unfroze, and he was the first to move and break the spell. In a flash, Cass had turned and vanished down the stairs to the boys' dormitories, his footsteps echoing off the stone as he went. Violet heard him wrench the door open, followed by a slam, and then silence again. Silence, broken shortly by her angry sobs. All the tension in her body drained away at once, leaving her boneless. Violet collapsed back into her chair and dropped her head onto the table, crying into her arms harder than she had cried in months. There was no one here to see her, no one around to judge her for being soft or weak or pathetica, whatever else they wanted to tease her for being. But nor was there anyone to hold her and tell her that things would be okay. That Cassius would come to his sense and love Tracy the way she deserved to be loved, or apologize to Violet for making her feel like a wretched friend. She was all alone, except something was tickling her finger. Violet raised her red-rimmed eyes and blinked, trying to clear the wateriness from her vision. There was something crawling across her hand, something black and shiny and many-legged. How'd you get back over here? Violet asked the beetle, which was slowly traversing the ridge of her knuckles. She watched it bumble along, turning her hand to this way and that to stop it from falling off. You didn't hear all of that, did you? The beetle wiggled its antennae at her. Violet sighed heavily. I just don't understand boys, she muttered wistfully to the bug. You think you know someone. She glanced back at the doorway Cass had disappeared through. Half of her expected to see him still standing there, staring pleadingly at her. She was relieved that he was not. Come on, Violet told the beetle, scooping it into her palm the way she had before and carrying it back over to the lost and found. I suppose you didn't like the shoe very much. What about a mitten? She held the beetle up to the shelf, waiting patiently as it meandered off of her hand. It looked up at her, wiggling its antennae again before disappearing into the opening of a woolen glove. Violet sighed again. Stay in there this time, she told the bug, and only felt half foolish for doing so. If Crookshanks catches you, he'll eat you. The beetle did not reply. Not that she expected it to, of course. Violet looked at the clock. It was after 1 o'clock now, and the allure of collapsing into a soft bed was far more tempting than trying to keep her eyes focused on words that weren't even helpful. Refusing to let herself glance at the boys' dormitory again, Violet gathered up her books, turned down the lamp, and headed to bed. Chapter 22. The Egg and the Eye. Determined to get ahead, start on deciphering the language of the clue, Violet leapt, shook Tracy awake at the crack of dawn, and dragged her along to the library. Shouldn't we bring Cass? Tracy asked sleepily. No, said Violet. Her tone came out very sharp, but fortunately Tracy was too busy yawning to notice it. She forced what she hoped was a mischievous smile onto her face and said, If we find anything, we can surprise him with him later, okay? It was a feeble lie, but not a poor one. And it had the desired effect of turning Tracy's mind away from waiting up for their sleeping friend. Though friend was a difficult thing for Violet to think of Cass as, after their conversation the night before. His confession of his feelings for her, and the terrible betrayal he committed against Tracy in the process, had left a distinctly sour note in Violet's opinion of him. It was going to be hard enough, looking up languages she didn't know anything about, without having Cass lurking about and mooning after her while Tracy wasn't looking. The library was empty when they arrived. but not closed. Violet half expected to find Harry there with Ron and Hermione, doing their own studying into the matter, but there was no sign of them anywhere between the shelves. She supposed Harry was still fuming after their run-in with Rita Skeeter, and Violet couldn't blame him for that. The two girls decided to split up, hoping to cast a wider net of the library's many strange and highly specific subjects. Tracy vanished into the stacks, peering sideways at the many piles of books that had yet to be sorted back into their proper place, while Violet perused the more orderly rows with notebook and quill in hand, waiting for some title or other to leap out at her. They'd been at it for only 20 minutes when Violet heard the door to the library open. Her heart seized. Had Cass come looking for them? For her? She peered nervously around the corner of a bookshelf, looking with just one eye to keep the rest of herself hidden. A small group of Ravenclaws had walked in, bright-eyed despite the early hour, and together made their way toward one of the many study tables arranged near the back of the room. Sighing in relief, Violet pulled another heavy leather-bound tome off the shelf and immediately almost dropped it in surprise. Between the remaining books, a pair of eyes were staring at her from the other side of the shelf. Violet stared in shock, mouth hanging open. She blinked rapidly, thinking perhaps her worst fears had come true. But these eyes were unfamiliar to her. Dark and intense, with a heavy brow set over them, the eyes bored back into hers. And then their owner spoke. "You are Potter, yes," said a voice muffled by the shelf. Violette Potter. It took her a moment to realize the person was speaking with a heavy accent, and a familiar one. This was someone from Durmstrang. Violet was immediately on guard. Yes," she said cautiously. "I'm Violet." "Do I know you?" The dark eyes glanced from side to side, as though making sure they were alone, which did nothing to put Violet at ease. She was even more confused, however, when the speaker moved several more books to the side, enough that she could fully see the face to whom the eyes and voice belonged, Victor Crumb. "Oh," Violet said, unable to hide her surprise. "Hello, did you want something?" "I can come around and SHH, Crumb said suddenly, glancing around once more. "Quiet, please. I vant to talk in secret with you about other Potter. He is your brother, yes." "Oh," Violet said again, now more confused than ever. "Ah, yeah, Harry's my brother. You are close with him." "Yes," Violet replied warily. Crumb stepped closer to the bookcase so that his face was nearly wedged into the shelf. When he spoke again, it was so quietly that Violet had to strain to hear him. "Do not tell anyone I tell you this," Crumb whispered, staring intently at her. "Tell Potter. Tell him put the egg in Vater." Violet's mouth fell open. Was Crumb helping her? In water," she repeated. Crumb nodded shortly. "Put egg in water and listen," he said, speaking quickly now. "Underneath all the way. Tell him do this hen he is alone. It is easier, you understand." Listen to the egg underwater," Violet said, and Crumb nodded again. "Good, V never spoke." His head vanished, leaving a gap between the books. "Wait," Violet hissed, stepping closer to the shelf. After a moment, Crumb's face returned, frowning. "V-Hat, why are you telling me this? Not that I don't appreciate it," she said quickly. "But I mean, you're supposed to be competing against Harry." "Why would you want to help him?" Crumb gnawed anxiously at the corner of his lip, brows deeply furrowed in thought. Finally, just when she was beginning to think he wouldn't tell her anything else, he said, "Hermione's worried for him, about the egg." "She van't say, but I know he has not solved it yet, no." Slowly, Violet shook her head. Crumb went on. "I van't fight to be fair," he said firmly. "Is not fair if only some of us know V-Hat is coming." "Has everyone else figured it out already?" Violet asked, her heart seizing in her chest. If the other champions already knew what they were up against and had been preparing all this time, while Harry floundered, not even knowing where to start. "Floor knows," Crumb muttered, taking care to glance around them once more. "I do not know about Varrington." "I know, because Karkaroff tells me." The bitterness in his tone was unmistakable, whether it was because the answer had been given to him instead of earned, or directed toward Karkaroff himself. She didn't know, and wasn't brave enough to ask. but the answer set the wheels of her mind to turning. "Thank you, Victor," Violet said quietly, meeting his intense gaze with her own. "Really, thank you. I won't tell anyone about this, I promise." "Not even Hermione," Crumb grunted. "She would be not happy." "Especially won't tell Hermione," Violet assured him. "This stays between us." Crumb held her gaze for a moment longer, as though testing the will of her resolve, then nodded one final time and disappeared once more. Violet listened to his footsteps hurrying away, fading from earshot after only a few seconds until they vanished entirely. A moment later, Tracy rounded the corner, eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Were you talking to somebody just now?" "Crumb," Violet answered truthfully, and could have kicked herself for doing so. "Sort of, Crumb." Tracy immediately stepped into the open aisle, looking just in time to see the doors closing behind Victor Crumb and his heavy furs. "You really spoke Tarkram. What did he say? Did he tell you something about the SHH? Violet hissed, dragging Tracy back in between the shelves. "He wasn't sup. He didn't want anyone to see him talking to me." "So what did he say?" asked Tracy excitedly, whispering now. "How did he even know who you were? Did he recognize you from being at the World Cup? If he did, he didn't mention it. And he was pretty hurt then, too, after the bludger hit him. But listen," Violet quickly peered around them, dropping her voice even lower. "He told me to tell Harry about the egg, about what to do with it." Tracy's eyes went as wide as saucers. And he said that all the other champions have already figured it out, including Cass." Tracy's mouth fell open. She now looked alarmingly like a goldfish. "And he didn't tell us," she said, at full volume, and Violet hurriedly clapped a hand over her mouth. "SHH, Violet recoiled as Tracy licked the palm of her hand, leaving it shining with slobber. "Stop shushing me, Violet," she said crossly, as Violet was frantically wiping her hand on the front of her own robes. "I've got every right to be mad at him for keeping something as important as this all to himself. Honestly, he's just as bad as Xiao sometimes." Violet's face flushed. The barbs stung, but it was not inaccurate. She'd keep an awful lot of things to herself, even knowing that she had lots of people who would have liked to hear about them. "Sorry," she muttered, but Tracy was no longer even looking at her. She had stepped back into the aisle, feet apart and hands on her hips, in a pose that Violet had come to consider a sort of war stance. "Are you gonna go talk to Harry?" she asked, staring down at the library's double doors. Yeah," Violet said. "Probably should sooner rather than later." "Good. I'll catch up with you later then," Tracy said, and began stomping her way down the aisle. "Wait, where are you going then? To yell at my boyfriend?" Violet's tummy did a sick sort of wobble as she watched Tracy storm away. Boyfriend. It was the first time, at least to her knowledge, that such a formal, definite description for the relationship between Tracy and Cass had been given. It made sense. Of course they sat together, ate together, held hands, went on dates with just the two of them. Those were the sorts of things boyfriends and girlfriends did together. They were the sorts of things she did with George, Violet realized with another lurch. But they were also the sorts of things that Violet did with Tracy. They held hands more often than they were apart, and had even spent many a night in each other's beds, curled up together for warmth or sprawled in a tangle of blankets and limbs. Didn't girlfriends and boyfriends do those sorts of things, too? Feeling even more confused than she'd been when she got there, Violet spared another quick glance around for eavesdroppers or witnesses, before tucking her chin to her chest and hurrying out of the library. "Take it where? Next time you take a bath," Violet repeated, keeping her voice low so as not to be overheard. "Take the golden egg with you." Harry blinked uncomprehendingly at her, his eyes still glazed with sleepiness. Violet had managed to ambush him outside of Gryffindor Tower after sprinting all the way from the library. Groggy Gryffindors were passing all around as they made their way down the staircase, heading toward the intoxicating smells of bacon and fresh toast coming from the great hall. "Why would I do that?" Harry asked, finally stirring from his sleepy stupor. His expression turned suddenly stricken. Please don't tell me all I've got to do is splash some water on it. Neville suggested that weeks ago, and I told him off. But if he's actually right, it's a little more complicated than that, Violet said quickly. At least, I think so. Honoring her promise to leave Crumb's name out of it, she told him only about Cass's wet hair and cryptic words thaimportantons, at least. All the rest of it had been packed into an ugly, writhing ball of sadness and confusion, and shoved as far, deep down inside of her belly, that Violet could get it, and it would stay there forever if she had anything to say about it. So long as she never had to look at Cassius Warrington ever again, everything would probably be fine. Harry, thankfully, was too distracted by the new information to notice anything was amiss. "Take it with me to the bath," he muttered, brows deeply furrowed in thought. Violet imagined if she stood close enough to him, she might actually hear the gears turning away in his head. When he finally met her gaze again, they were right outside the doors of the great hall, with a fresh spark of determination in his eyes. "You're a lifesaver, Romans 6, said Harry seriously. "And tell Cass I said thanks, all right. Looks like he'll be up any minute." Violet followed Harry's eyeline over her shoulder to the entrance to the dungeons, where her fellow Slytherins were just beginning to emerge. The ball of feelings in her stomach gave a nasty wobble, and she turned back to Harry in a panic. Do you mind if I eat with you today?" Violet asked quickly. "Why?" Harry asked, eyebrows raised in surprise. "I mean, yeah, of course you can, but don't you want to sit with your friends?" "No, because I might throw up on them," Violet thought. She managed to bite that back, but only just. "We're sort of on the outs right now, actually," she said instead, which wasn't a lie she'd resolved to lie less to Harry after the big blowout over Professor Snape's lessons. But there was no way Violet was getting into the whole truth of it with him. For a moment it looked as though Harry was going to pry, but to Violet's surprise, he simply nodded. "You can tell me about it later if you want," he said. "Come on, I'll make sure you get a seat." The Gryffindor table was more than happy to welcome her Angelina Johnson, whom she'd bonded with at the Yule Ball, gave Violet a tired smile and wave, and even Ron didn't seem bothered at the sight of her. Especially not after Harry gave him and Hermione the news. When the egg was mentioned, he gasped loudly. "The lake," he said, looking wide-eyed across the great hall. "Bloody hell, we just saw Crumb jumping in." "You don't reckon he's worked it out too, do you?" "He probably has," Hermione said, frowning. When Ron turned to her, eyes narrowed suspiciously, she snapped, "Not because I'm helping him. I've told you I'd never help him figure out that egg, Ron." "Yeah, all right, so you say." "It just sounded like Karkaroff's really clever," Hermione said over him. "We already know the other champions are getting help from their headmasters, and I'd bet anything Fleur's already worked it out as well. But what about Cassius?" "I doubt he's getting help from Professor Dumbledore, so how did he work it out?" "I'm not sure," Violet said, frowning. "But I know he's been working hard on it." "Well, that's more than Harry's been doing, so, hey. Now all he has to do is find a good time to go out to the lake, and I'm not going into the lake," Harry said loudly. Violet elbowed him hard in the ribs. "Keep your voice down," she hissed. "I'm not supposed to be helping you. You could get us both into trouble." "It's the middle of January," Harry grumbled, wincing as he rubbed at his side. "Maybe it's considered warm where Crumb comes from, but I think it's freezing out, and if I go out there with the egg somebody's bound to see me and wonder what I'm up to." "You could take the invisibility cloak," Hermione suggested. "Not into the water," said Ron, frowning. "I mean, you don't want it to get ruined, and it'd drip on the way back." "I don't suppose I could just chuck it into a toilet," said Harry doubtfully. "Maybe Moaning Myrtle could go in and tell me what it says." Violet grimaced. "Please don't put the egg in a toilet, Harry." "Oh, but maybe." Violet looked around quickly, peering up and down the length of the Gryffindor table. She didn't have to look very far. Fred and George were just walking into the great hall, apparently deep in serious conversation. Violet waved them over, and their faces brightened. "Morning, Roman 6, George said, sliding into the seat on her other side, pressing a quick kiss to her cheek as he did. "Morning, Ronald," said Fred, trying to do the same thing to Ron, who hit him. You get off. To what do we owe the absolute pleasure of your company this morning? Said George, grinning at her and batting his eyelashes. Violet flushed and had to fight to keep a straight face. I've got a silly question, she said, but you've got to promise not to laugh at me. No promises, said Fred and George together, but go on. Does Hogwarts happen to have a swimming pool? The twins glanced at each other. Fred lowered his voice and said, Not exactly, but there is the prefect's bathroom. Sneaking out of the common room after hours was old hat for Violet, even without using her special ring. The stone wall hiding the entrance slid soundlessly away as she stepped out into the chilly dungeon hall, and only just managed to stifle a shout as Harry's disembodied hand appeared to wave her over. Without a word, she joined him beneath the invisibility cloak, and the two of them set off into the night. It had been a long time since just the two of them had been on an adventure together. They more often struck out on their own, or with their respective friends, if more than one pair of hands or eyes were required for the late-night task they had in mind. But tonight's plan called for tools that only each other could provide. Violet's Marauder's map and Harry's invisibility cloak. It was more awkward than usual moving under the cloak together, because both of them had their hands full, Harry with the egg clutched to his chest, and Violet with the map held in front of her nose. However, the moonlit corridors were empty and silent, and by checking the map at strategic intervals, Violet was able to ensure that they wouldn't run into anyone they wanted to avoid. When they reached the statue of Boris the Bewildered, a lost-looking wizard with his gloves on the wrong hands, Harry moved to the front, located the right door, and muttered the password into it, just as Fred and George had told him. The door creaked open. Harry hesitated. "Are you sure you'll be all right out here?" he whispered, looking anxiously at her. Violet nodded. She'd agreed to keep watch outside in case Mr. Filch or anyone else came snooping around. It wasn't the most exciting prospect, sitting around in the dark by herself while Harry was off solving the clue, but if the alternative was watching her brother take a bath. "I'll be fine, I promise," she whispered back. "I've got the cloak. If I see anyone coming, I'll run inside and we can both hide under it." Harry still looked worried, but they couldn't very well stand there and argue about it. Quick as a flash, he darted out from beneath the cloak and through the door, closing it immediately after him. And Violet was left alone to wait. She watched dutifully on the map for signs of anyone approaching, but not much of anyone seemed to be stirring tonight. She could see her own little dart, helpfully labeled Violet putter-jittering slightly outside the bathroom door, and within the room she watched as Harry puttered around the room. He went back and forth quite a few times, then sat still. After about 10 minutes he moved again, and Violet thought he might be coming back out, but then watched in dismay as he went right back to where he was before and stopped moving altogether. Finally, just as Violet was reaching the pinnacle of her boredom, the door creaked open and Harry's face appeared in the gap. He looked around the corridor, which, to him, must have looked deserted. "Violet, are you there?" A waft of strong, soapy perfume washed past him from within the bathroom. Violet, not trusting herself to speak without coughing, stuck her hand from beneath the cloak and gave a thumbs up. Harry grinned and hurried to join her under the fabric. "So," Violet said eagerly, "did you solve it?" Sort of. It's a riddle. All the screeching was actually a song, but I couldn't hear it properly until it was under the water, because it's Inmermish." "That's brilliant," Violet gasped. "Did you write it down?" "No, but I think I remember it." Harry furrowed his brow in concentration and began to recite. "Come seek us where our voices sound. We cannot sing above the ground. And while you're searching, ponder this. We've taken what you'll sorely miss. An hour long you'll have to look, and to recover what we took. But past an hour the prospect's black. Too late, it's gone, it won't come back. We cannot sing above the ground," Violet repeated slowly. "An hour long to look. Oh, Harry. It sounds an awful lot like you've got to be underwater for an hour." "In the Black Lake," said Harry, now looking quite grim. There's merfolk down there, and they've taken something I'm supposed to get back. That's what Myrtle said anyways. Myrtle, Violet said with a start. Moaning Myrtle. She wasn't in there with you, was she? Harry didn't answer, but his expression grew even grimmer. Violet recoiled. Harry, you were in Thebath. Inno, he hissed, cheeks reddening. That's what I told her, but she wouldn't leave. But there were loads of bubbles, and I swear I made her cover her eyes when I got out besides. She said she'd seen Warrington in here, too, when he brought his egg. Violet pulled a face. He didn't say anything about that. I don't blame him, Harry grumbled. He hefted the golden egg firmly under his arm. We should head back before anyone notices us missing. Before setting off, Violet examined the Marauder's map to check that the coast was still clear. Yes, the darts belonging to Filch and his cat, Mrs. Norris, were safely in their office. Nothing else seemed to be moving apart from Peeves, though he was bouncing around the trophy room on the floor above. Violet had taken a single step back toward the entrance hall when something else on the map caught her eye. Something distinctly odd. Peeves was not the only thing that was moving. A single dart was flitting around a room in the bottom left-hand corner, Professor Snape's office. But the dart wasn't labeled Severus Snape. It was Bartemius Crouch. Violet stopped moving and stared at the dart. Mr. Crouch was supposed to be too ill to go to work or come to the Yule Ball, so what was he doing sneaking into Hogwarts at 1 o'clock in the morning? What's wrong? Harry asked, peeking over her shoulder. Wordlessly, Violet pointed to the dart. Harry's eyes widened. Violet could see on his face that he was thinking the same thing she had, and knew at once that neither of them was going back to bed just yet. Let's go see what he's up to, she murmured, and the two of them set off before Harry had even finished nodding in agreement. They walked down the stairs as quietly as possible, though the faces in some of the portraits still turned curiously at the squeak of a floorboard, the rustle of their pajamas. With Violet still in the lead, they crept along the corridor below, pushed aside a tapestry about halfway along, and proceeded down a narrower staircase, a shortcut that would take them down 2 floors. Violet couldn't help but keep glancing down at the map, wondering. It just didn't seem in character, somehow, for correct, law-abiding Mr. Crouch to be sneaking around somebody else's office this late at night. And Wisnape's office, of all places. It just didn't seem. Hold on, is this the staircase with the... Harry's whispered query came a half-second too late. Not thinking about what she was doing, not concentrating on anything but the peculiar behavior of Mr. Crouch, Violet's leg suddenly sank right through the trick step that she should have remembered was there. She gave an ungainly wobble and would have fallen if not for Harry reaching out to steady her, but at a terrible cost. The golden egg, still damp from the bath, slipped from his hands. Violet lurched forward to try and catch it, but hands full with the map, fumbled them both. The egg fell down the staircase with a bang as loud as a drum on every step. The map fluttered out of her grasp and slid down 6 stairs, where, sunk in the step to above her knee, Violet couldn't reach it. The golden egg fell through the tapestry at the bottom of the staircase, burst open, and began wailing loudly in the corridor below. Harry grabbed Violet beneath the armpits, trying to pull her free of the stair. "The map!" she hissed, pointing frantically to where it had fallen. "Get the map!" Harry let go of her abruptly, making her sink straight back into the step. He was trying to untangle himself from under the cloak when Peeves. It was the unmistakable hunting cry of Filch the caretaker. Violet could hear his rapid, shuffling footsteps coming nearer and nearer, his wheezy voice raised in fury. "What's this racket? Wake up the whole castle, will you? I'll have you, Peeves, I'll have you, you'll." "And what's this?" Filch's footsteps halted. There was a clink of metal on metal, and the wailing stopped. Filch had picked up the egg and closed it. Harry and Violet both held very still, clinging to one another, listening. Any moment now, Filch was going to pull aside the tapestry, expecting to see Peeves, and there would be no Peeves. But if he came up the stairs, he would spot the Marauder's map. And invisibility cloak or not, the map would show Harry Potter and Violet Potter standing exactly where they were. "Egg," Filch said quietly at the foot of the stairs. "My sweet." Mrs. Norris was obviously with him. This is a Triwizard clue. This belongs to a school champion. Violet felt sick. Her heart was hammering very fast. Peeves, roared Filch gleefully. You've been stealing. He ripped back the tapestry below, and Violet saw his horrible, pouchy face and bulging, pale eyes starting up the dark, and to Filch, deserted staircase. Hiding, are you? He said softly. I'm coming to get you, Peeves. You've gone and stolen a Triwizard clue, Peeves. Dumbledore'll have you out of here for this, you filthy, pilfering poltergeist. Filch started to climb the stairs, his scrawny, dust-colored cat at his heels. Mrs. Norris' lamp-like eyes, so very like her master's, were fixed directly on the twins. Violet had had occasion before now to wonder whether the invisibility cloak worked on cats. Sick with apprehension, she watched Filch drawing nearer and nearer in his old flannel dressing gown. Harry tugged desperately on her arm, trying to wrench her free. But Violet was too frozen in horror to help any second now. Filch was going to spot the map, or walk right into them. Filch. What's going on? Filch stopped a few steps below the twins and turned. At the foot of the stairs was the only person who could make their situation worse, Professor Snape. He was wearing a long grey nightshirt, and he looked livid. It's Peeves, Professor, Filch whispered malevolently. He threw this egg down the stairs. Snape climbed the stairs quickly and stopped beside Filch. Violet heard Harry stop breathing behind her and followed suit, though surely the sounds of their loudly thumping hearts would give them away at any second. Peeves, said Snape softly, staring at the egg in Filch's hands. But Peeves couldn't get into my office. This egg was in your office, Professor. Of course not, Snape snapped. I heard banging and wailing. Yes, Professor, that was the egg. I was coming to investigate. Peeves threw it, Professor. And when I passed my office, I saw the torches were lit and a cupboard door was ajar. Somebody had been searching it. But Peeves couldn't. I know he couldn't, Filch, Snape snapped again. I seal my office with a spell none but a wizard could break. Snape looked up the stairs, straight through Violet and Harry, and then into the corridor below. I want you to come and help me search for the intruder, Filch. Yes, Professor, but Filch looked yearningly up the stairs, through the twins, who could see that he was very reluctant to forego the chance of cornering Peeves. Go, Violet pleaded with him silently, go with Snape. Go, Mrs. Norris peering around Filch's legs. With all the perfume still clinging to Harry from his bath, Violet was sure the cat could smell them. The thing is, Professor, said Filch plaintively, the headmaster will have to listen to me this time. Peeves has been stealing from a student. It might be my chance to get him thrown out of the castle once, and for all, Filch, I don't give a damn about the wretched poltergeist. It's my office that's clunk. Clunk, clunk. Professor Snape stopped talking very abruptly. He and Filch both looked down at the foot of the stairs. Violet and Harry saw Mad-Eye Moody limp into sight through the narrow gap between their heads. Moody was wearing his traveling cloak over his own nightshirt and leaning on his staff as usual. Pajama party, is it? He growled up the stairs. Professor Snape and I heard noises, Professor, said Filch at once. Peeves the poltergeist, throwing things around as usual, and then Professor Snape discovered that someone had broken into his off. Shut up, Snape hissed to Filch. Moody took a step closer to the foot of the stairs. Violet saw Moody's magical eye travel over Snape, and then, unmistakably, onto herself. Violet couldn't help the soft gasp that escaped her mouth. Moody could see through invisibility cloaks. He alone could see the full strangeness of the scene. Snape in his nightshirt, Filch clutching the egg, Violet trapped in the stairs, and Harry hunched on the ground behind her. Moody's lopsided gash of a mouth opened in surprise. For a few seconds, he stared right at the pair of them. Then Moody closed his mouth and turned his blue eye upon Professor Snape again. Did I hear that correctly, Snape? He asked slowly. Someone broke into your office. It is unimportant, said Snape stiffly. On the contrary, growled Moody, it is very important. Who'd want to break into your office? A student, I dare say, said Professor Snape. Violet could see a vein flickering horribly on his greasy temple. It has happened before. Potion ingredients have gone missing from my private store cupboard. Students attempting illicit mixtures, no doubt. Reckon they were after your potion ingredients, eh? Said Moody. Not hiding anything else in your office, are you? Violet saw the edge of Professor Snape's sallow face turn the same nasty brick color it had when Sirius Black walked into his classroom. You know I'm hiding nothing, Moody, he said in a soft and dangerous voice, as you've searched my office pretty thoroughly yourself. Moody's face twisted into a smile. Aura's privilege, Snape. Dumbledore told me to keep an eye. Dumbledore happens to trust me, said Snape through clenched teeth. I refuse to believe that he gave you orders to search my office. Course Dumbledore trusts you, growled Moody. He's a trusting man, isn't he? Believes in second chances. But me, I say there are spots that don't come off, Snape. Spots that never come off. Do you know what I mean? Professor Snape suddenly did something very strange. He seized his left forearm convulsively with his right hand, as though something on it had hurt him. Moody laughed. Get back to bed, Snape. You don't have the authority to send me anywhere, Snape hissed, letting go of his arm as though angry with himself. I have as much right to prowl this school after dark as you do. Prowl away, said Moody, but his voice was full of menace. I look forward to meeting you in a dark corridor sometime. You've dropped something, by the way. With a stab of true horror, Violet saw Moody point at the Marauder's map, still lying on the staircase 6 steps below her. As Snape and Filch both turned to look at it, Harry threw caution to the wind and raised his arms under the cloak and waved furiously at Moody to attract his attention, pointing at himself and Violet. Professor Snape had reached out for it, a horrible expression of dawning comprehension on his face, a Keo parchment. The map flew up into the air, slipped through Snape's outstretched fingers, and soared down the stairs into Moody's hand. My mistake, Moody said calmly. Its mine must have dropped it earlier, but Professor Snape's black eyes were darting from the egg in Filch's arms to the map in Moody's hand, and Violet could tell he was putting 2 and 2 together as only Snape could. Potter, he said quietly. What's that? Said Moody calmly, folding up the map and pocketing it. Potter, Snape snarled, and he actually turned his head and stared right at the place where the twins were, as if he could suddenly see them. That egg is Potter's egg. That piece of parchment belongs to his sister. I have seen it before. I recognize it. They're here, both of them. The Potters in that damned cloak. Professor Snape stretched out his hands like a blind man and began to move up the stairs. Violet could swear his overlarge nostrils were dilating, trying to sniff them out still trapped. Violet leaned backward against her brother, trying to avoid Snape's fingertips, but any moment now. There's nothing there, Snape, barked Moody. But I'll be happy to tell the headmaster how quickly your mind jumped to the Potters. Meaning what? Meaning that Dumbledore's very interested to know who's got it in for them, said Moody, limping nearer still to the foot of the stairs. And so am I, Snape. Very interested. The torchlight flickered across his mangled face, so that the scars and the chunk missing from his nose looked deeper and darker than ever. Professor Snape was looking down at Moody, and Violet couldn't see the expression on his face. For a moment, nobody moved or said anything. Then Snape slowly lowered his hands. I merely thought, said Professor Snape in a voice of forced calm, that if Potter was wandering around after hours again, it's an unfortunate habit of his, one of many poor influences he exerts on his sister. He should be stopped. For their safety. Ah, I see, said Moody softly. Got the Potter's best interests at heart, have you? And here I'd heard you weren't too fond of the boy. There was a long pause. Snape and Moody were still staring at each other. Mrs. Norris gave a loud meow, still peering around Filch's legs, looking for the source of Harry's bubble bath smell. I think I will go back to bed, Snape said curtly. Best idea you've had all night, said Moody. Now, Filch, if you'll just give me that egg. No, said Filch, clutching the egg as though it were his firstborn son. Professor Moody, this is evidence of Peeves' treachery. It's the property of the champion he stole it from, said Moody. Hand it over now. Professor Snape swept downstairs and past Moody without another word. Filch made a chirruping noise to Mrs. Norris, who stared blankly at Harry and Violet for a few more seconds before turning and following her master. Still trying to hold her breath, Violet heard Snape walking away down the corridor. Filch handed Moody the egg and disappeared from view too, muttering to Mrs. Norris, "Never mind, my sweet. We'll see Dumbledore in the morning. Tell him what Peeves was up to." A door slammed. Violet and Harry were left staring down at Professor Moody, who placed his staff on the bottommost stair and started to climb laboriously toward them, a dulclunkin every other step. "Close shave, you two," he muttered. "Yeah, thanks," said Harry weakly. "What is this thing?" said Moody, drawing the Marauder's map out of his pocket and unfolding it. Harry, who had just thrown back the cloak and started pulling Violet out of the trick step, said "Map of Hogwarts." At the same time that she said, "It's nothing." Moody's normal eye glanced between them, while his magical eye stared at the map, going haywire in its socket. "Merlin's beard," Moody whispered as, with a great heave, Harry managed to pull Violet completely free of the stair. This is some map. "Our dad made it," Violet said, wincing as she massaged her freed leg. It had gone to pins and needles and was now starting to really hurt. "But it's mine now. Well, mine and Harry's, ours." "Mostly yours," Harry muttered. Moody was still gazing at the map. "Potter," he said slowly, and they both looked up at him. "You didn't happen, by any chance, to see who broke into Snape's office, did you? On this map, I mean." I Violet's first instinct was to lie, to deny having witnessed anything at all. But she had the horrible thought that Moody, with his magical eye and history of rounding up the darkest and most evil wizards on the planet, would see right through her in more ways than one. She swallowed the lie before it could pass her teeth and started again. "Yeah, we did," Violet admitted. "That's why we were coming to check it out. It was Mr. Crouch." Moody's magical eye whizzed over the entire surface of the map. He looked suddenly alarmed. "Crouch," he said. You're sure, girl?" "Positive," said Harry. "We both saw him on there." "Well, he's not here anymore," said Moody, his eye still whizzing over the map. "Crouch, that's very, very interesting." He said nothing for almost a full minute, still staring at the map. Violet could tell that this news meant something to Moody, even more than it did to her and Harry, and very badly wanted to know what it was. But Moody still scared her slightly, and it didn't seem her place to be asking questions like that. Thankfully, Harry was with her. Harry, having never cared about whether it was his place to do something or not, opened his mouth and asked, Professor Moody, why do you reckon Mr. Crouch wanted to look around Snape's office?" Moody's magical eye left the map and fixed, quivering, upon Harry. It was a penetrating glare, one that surely would have set Violet to cowering if it had been turned on her. "Put it this way, Potter," Moody muttered finally. "They say old Mad Eye's obsessed with catching dark wizards. But I'm nothing compared to Barty Crouch." He continued to stare at the map. Violet sat very still, processing that. "Professor Moody," Harry said again, after a moment's pause, "do you think, could this have anything to do with, maybe Mr. Crouch thinks there's something going on?" "Like what?" said Moody sharply. Harry glanced at Violet, his expression questioning. She gulped hard. "We've heard things," Violet muttered, "and odd stuff's been happening lately, hasn't it? It's been in Thedley Prophet. And the Dark Mark at the World Cup, and the Death Eaters and everything." Both of Moody's mismatched eyes widened. "You're a couple of sharp ones, aren't you?" he said. His magical eye roved back to the Marauder's map. "Crouch could be thinking along those lines," he said slowly. "Very possible. There have been some funny rumors flying around lately, helped along by Rita Skeeter, of course. It's making a lot of people nervous, I reckon." A grim smile twisted his lopsided mouth. "Oh, if there's one thing I hate," he muttered, more to himself than to either of them, and his magical eye was fixed on the left-hand corner of the map. "It's a Death Eater who walked free." Violet's stomach lurched. Could Moody possibly mean what she thought he meant? All the fears and suspicions that had been nagging at her, the answers to questions she wasn't brave enough to ask. About Professor Snape. But her voice failed her once again as Moody fixed both eyes on her. "And now, I want to ask I owe you a question, girl, said Moody in a more businesslike tone. Violet gulped again. She had thought this was coming. She'd already blurted out her father's connection to the map, which was a very dubious magical object. But surely Moody was going to ask her where she got it, and the story of how it had fallen into her hands incriminated not only her and Harry, but Fred and George Weasley, and Professor Lupin, who had let her keep it, and Sirius, who had also authored the map that Moody was now brandishing in front of her. Can I borrow this? Oh, said Violet. She was very fond of her map, and none too keen on letting it go to anyone besides Harry. But there wasn't any way she could think of turning Moody down. He had, after all, just rescued them from both Filch and Professor Snape, and given that they were still in the process of breaking several school rules and could be punished at any time, she didn't quite feel she was in any position to say no. All right. Good girl, growled Moody. I can make good use of this. This might be exactly what I've been looking for. Right, bed. Come on now, the both of you. They climbed to the top of the stairs together, Moody still examining the map, as though it was a treasure the likes of which he had never seen before. They walked in silence to the door of Moody's office, where he stopped and looked back at Harry. I'm guessing you weren't just taking that egg for a walk tonight. No, said Harry, grinning. We've been working out the clue. Moody, his magical eye flickering over to Violet. Should have known. Funny thing about twins that it's damn near impossible to keep them apart. Harry and Violet looked at one another, grinning slyly. That's right, sir, said Violet. We've always got each other's backs. Both of Moody's eyes went to Violet's face, and she got the distinct impression that she was being sized up. Whatever conclusion Moody came to must have been favorable, because he nodded. Glad to hear that. Now, get to bed, you two. See you in the morning. He went back into his office, staring down at the Marauder's map again, and closed the door behind him. Violet and Harry made it to the entrance hall, where they went their separate ways to their respective houses. Cheered as she was that Harry had finally solved the egg's riddle, Violet struggled to sink into a peaceful sleep. Her mind kept swirling with questions about Mr. Crouch and Professor Snape and what it all meant. Why was Crouch pretending to be ill if he could manage to get to Hogwarts when he wanted to? What did he think Snape was concealing in his office? If Dumbledore was really giving Snape a second chance, then what had he done with his first?